Today's story starts like many other true crime stories. However, this one comes with a very unexpected twist at the end, one that is exceptionally brutal and graphic. As such, viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please deliver a box of Girl Scout cookies to the 5-star review button, but before you hand them over, eat them all and replace them with stale saltines. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Brittany Norwood was born in 1982 in Federal Way, Washington, which is a small city located about 20 miles south of Seattle. Growing up, Brittany's family never had much money. Her father, who was the primary breadwinner, ran a small upholstery shop in town, and while he worked tirelessly, he barely earned enough money to make ends meet. And considering how large Brittany's family was, she was one of 9 siblings, the lack of financial resources at times made life very challenging. However, Brittany's parents were not complainers, and they instilled in all of their children the importance of hard work regardless of circumstance. And clearly that message resonated with their children because by the time Brittany was a teenager, her older siblings had already gone on to become doctors, engineers, and management consultants. As for Brittany, she was just as ambitious as her older siblings, but her interests were in athletics. By the time she was in high school, she had become one of the very best soccer players in the entire state of Washington. She was so good, in fact, that by her senior year of high school in 2000, the best college soccer programs in America were actively recruiting her. She would finally settle on attending Stony Brook University in Long Island, New York, because they offered her a fantastic scholarship and they were known for their excellent soccer program. Brittany was incredibly proud of her scholarship. It not only represented the hard work pays off motto that her parents had preached all of her life, but it also lifted a serious financial burden off of her parents. So in the fall of 2000, Brittany left Washington State and headed east to New York to begin her collegiate career. But right away, she struggled. Brittany had never left home before, and now she was suddenly 3,000 miles away from her family and her friends, and she missed them terribly. Within the first few days of being at her new school, she called her family and told them how much she missed them and how she kind of regretted coming to New York in the first place, but they reassured her that she had made the right choice, that these feelings were normal, and she just needed to give it some time. But despite taking her family's advice and sticking it out at Stony Brook, Brittany never really felt like she belonged there. She made friends, she got good grades, and performed well on the soccer team, but with every passing semester, Brittany became less and less connected to the school and the people there and just longed to be home. And so with that in mind, in 2003, so 3 years after she had arrived at Stony Brook, Brittany was at her school feeling down about her situation when she had a serious lapse in judgment. Brittany, who had never gotten in trouble in her life before, randomly stole one of her teammates' things out of their locker. She didn't even know why she did it. It just kind of happened, and then pretty much immediately she got caught. And as soon as she returned what she had taken. She felt horrible and she apologized, but the damage was done. The incident had already been reported to the school, and the school had a very strict code of conduct policy, which theft was in clear violation of. And so Brittany had her scholarship revoked, and without it, her family could no longer afford the school, and so she had to come back home. And when she got home, she felt like she had let her entire family down. And so for the next several years, the shadow of this huge mistake loomed over her like a dark cloud. She just kind of kept her head down and took part-time work here and there, but for the most part, while she was home, she was just sad and directionless. But finally, in 2010, so 7 years after coming home from school, when Brittany was now 28 years old, she decided enough was enough. She was going to stop letting this mistake define her life. She was going to go out and find a career and make something of her life, like her other siblings had. And the career move that seemed to make the most sense to her was becoming a personal trainer. Despite not playing soccer anymore, fitness was still a very big part of her life, and she loved the idea of helping other people get fit and stay fit. And so she began looking at where personal trainers were the most in demand, and she found Washington, D.C. was a total hotspot, and it just so happened 2 of her siblings were already living there. And so that year, she packed up her stuff and she headed out to D.C. as well. When she got there, she had a little cash, but not enough to sustain her longer than a month or 2, so she applied for and got a job with a Lululemon shop. Lululemon is a company that sells yoga athletic apparel. The shop was located in Bethesda, which is a very wealthy suburb of Washington, D.C., and right around the corner from the shop was a gym that Brittany immediately fell in love with and decided would be the perfect gym for her to run her personal training practice out of once she got certified. So a very happy and rejuvenated Brittany began work at the Lululemon shop in Bethesda in late 2010, fully expecting to only be there for a few months before she transitioned to her personal training career. At around the same time Brittany began working at the store, another young woman had started working there as well. Her name was Jana Murray, and she was quite similar to Brittany. She was 30, so 2 years older than Brittany, and she had been raised in a close-knit, modest household in Texas where her parents had preached always working hard and doing the right thing, and she really took that to heart. And like Brittany, Jana was also a star high school athlete, except instead of playing soccer, she was a big track and field star. And actually, she set some records in Texas for the discus throw. But after graduating high school, instead of pursuing athletics in college, Jana had pursued business. She enrolled in the business program at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. After she graduated, she worked in the private sector for a few years before deciding it made sense for her to go back to school to earn her master's degree in business. She was accepted to the very prestigious Johns Hopkins Business School, which was located a few miles from the Lululemon shop where Brittany worked. And by 2010, Jana was in her final semester, and all she had left to complete was a final thesis paper. A thesis is a long essay involving personal research. The assignment was to write about the structure of a company of her choosing. And since Jana was a huge fan of Lululemon apparel, she had decided to write about them. And during her research on Lululemon, she discovered that the company was far more than just clothing. They had what seemed to be a really cool company culture. All employees, no matter how junior, were encouraged to pursue whatever goals they had, even if their goals meant leaving Lululemon at some point. It was like the company fundamentally cared more about their people than their product. And Jana loved that. And so as she's writing this paper, on a whim, she decides to go get a job at a Lululemon store. And the nearest location was the one near her school. Jana figured working at the shop would only make it easier to finish her thesis, since it would provide her boots-on-the-ground information. Also, she just wanted to see for herself if this company was as amazing as it seemed to be. And so her plan was just to work at this shop until her thesis was done, at which point she'd earn her master's and more than likely she would quit and move on with her life. So in late 2010, when Brittany and Jana found themselves working at the same Lululemon shop in Bethesda, they were aware of each other, but really didn't know each other. Their only interactions were when their shifts happened to overlap, which did not happen very often. But when it did, they were perfectly nice to each other. They would chit-chat, but they were coworkers, not really friends. However, a terrifying event was about to link them together forever. On the evening of March 11th, 2011, Jana and Brittany were working together at the Lululemon. It was an uneventful shift. They chatted, they helped customers, and in between all of that, they would knock out whatever closing duties they were responsible for so that when closing time came, they could leave quickly. And then when it was closing time at 8 p.m., the pair did one last sweep of the store to make sure everything was neat and put away and locked, and then they both grabbed their things and headed out the front door. Once they were outside, Jana turned around and she pulled the keys out of her pocket and she locked the front door. And then Jana hopped in her car and she drove off. And Brittany, she turned and began walking down the sidewalk toward the metro train station. But after only a few minutes of walking, Brittany swung her backpack off of her shoulder right in front of her, and she reached inside to fish around for her wallet because her metro train pass was inside of her wallet. And so she's fishing around her bag, she's still walking towards the train, and she can't find it. And so she comes to a full stop, she unzips her bag completely, and she looks inside, and her wallet is not in there. And as soon as she sees that it's missing, she remembers she left it on the break room table at the Lululemon store. And the only way she could go back and get her wallet was if Jana came back with the keys and unlocked the front door. And so Brittany just stood there for a minute wondering what she should do. She kind of felt bad about calling Jana to drive back and open the store for her, but she really needed her wallet for a whole bunch of reasons. And so finally, she picks up her cell phone and she calls Jana. And when Jana picks up, Brittany says, I'm really sorry, but I left my wallet in the store. Would you mind coming back and just opening the doors for me? I'll run in and I'll get it. Be super quick. And Jana, surprisingly, was totally fine with this. She actually laughed and said, I left my laptop in the break room and I was going to get it tomorrow, but this is an excuse to go back and get it now. And so Jana told Brittany she would be back at the front of the store in just a couple of minutes. And so Brittany thanked her. They hung up the phone, and then Brittany turned and she began running back towards Lululemon. When Brittany arrived at the front of the store, Jana was already there, and Brittany immediately said, "I'm so sorry. Thank you so much for coming back." And Jana said, "Really, it's no big deal." And then Jana pulled her key out and she opened the front door of the store and they stepped inside. The layout of the store was basically just a big square where the front door entered the square right in the middle of it. So you step inside, you're in this kind of main shopping area. It's just this one square. And then all the way at the back, kind of lined up with the front door, behind the cash registers, was this employee-only hallway that went straight back about 7 or 8 feet. And then it reached this T intersection where if you turned left, there would be another hallway that went straight for maybe 10 or 15 feet, and it would come to a dead end at a door, and that door would lead to a bathroom. And then if you were standing in front of that bathroom door and looked left, there would be another door that led into a very small kitchen. And then if you went back to the T intersection and turned right and looked straight ahead, you would see another stretch of hallway that was about 10 or 15 feet long, and it would look exactly like the left hallway, except at the end of the right hallway, there was no door to a bathroom. It was just kind of a dead end. But at the end of the right hallway, if you walked all the way down it and then turned right, you would see there was a door that led into the break room. So the break room and the kitchen were kind of oriented in the same position at either ends of each hallway. And so the two women go inside the store with Brittany in the front. They get inside, Jana flips on the lights, and they walk across that square main shopping area. They go past the cash registers into that employee-only hallway. They go straight down, they turn right, they make their way down the right hallway, and then they open the door to the break room, and they go inside. Brittany very quickly found her wallet. It was on the table. She grabbed it. And so after she had her wallet, she just left the break room and began walking back out towards the main shopping area and the front door. Jana was only a couple of seconds behind her. She grabbed her laptop and then she left the break room. She walked back down the hallway. And as she turned back into the main shopping area, she kind of had her head down. She was fiddling with her laptop and her phone. But even though she wasn't looking up, just looking down, she could tell right in front of her, Brittany had come to a full stop in the middle of the main shopping area. And so as soon as she saw that, she stopped what she was doing and she looked up. And immediately she could see why Brittany had come to a stop. There were now 2 men wearing all black with black ski masks on that were standing between them and the front door. The following morning, the Lululemon employee who was supposed to come in that morning and open the store and work that day, she turns onto the street that the shop is on and she begins walking towards the front door. It's a bright, beautiful, sunny morning. There are lots of people out going about their daily routines. And so this employee, she walks right up to the front door of the Lululemon. She's not really looking into the store. She's kind of got her head down and she fishes in her pocket. She pulls out her key that opens the front door. She slots it into the lock and she turns it to unlock it. And right away, she feels no resistance. The door was already unlocked. And so this really gets her attention and she looks up, but there's a glare on the glass from the sunlight, so she can't see inside. And so she just pulls the key out of the lock and then she pushes open the door and she takes a very tentative step inside. And right away she sees the entire store is destroyed. There are shelves knocked over, there's clothing everywhere. It's a complete mess. And before she can even process what she's seeing, she hears what sounds like moaning coming from the back of the store, basically back in those hallways. And so this employee is terrified, and instead of going in to investigate, she just turns around and leaves the store and immediately calls 911. And as she's on the phone with police, this man who just happened to be walking by at this moment, he saw her and saw how visibly upset she was. And so he just stood next to her and waited for her to get off the phone with the police. And then when she was, he asked her, what's going on? And she would explain that the door was unlocked, the store is a complete disaster, and I heard moaning inside and I'm too scared to go in. And so the man says, hey, I'm going to go in there and take a look around because I'm worried there could be someone who's hurt, who needs our help right now before the police even get here. And so this man walks through the front door of the Lululemon, and right away, as soon as he steps in, he steps on broken glass and he looks up and the store is completely destroyed. Everything's knocked over. And he immediately hears the moaning coming from the back of the store. And so he very carefully starts walking straight ahead through the store, stepping over shelves that have been knocked down and trying hard not to destroy any merchandise that's on the ground. And when he reaches the back of the store, basically the entrance to this employee hallway that goes straight back, he hears the moaning, but he can't really tell which hallway it's coming from. And so he just calls out like, hey, who's back there? Do you need my help? But there was no reaction. And so he begins walking forward and then he stops. He realizes the ground is slick. And so he looks down and he sees there's a very obvious blood trail from where he is standing straight back down this employee hallway. And the blood trail appears to turn right and kind of disappears out of sight down that right hallway. And so the man is terrified. He turns around and he looks towards the front of the store, kind of hoping that maybe the police or the paramedics would get there. But it's just the employee he had spoken to, and she looks terrified. And so the man decides, if there's someone hurt back here, I really need to go see what's wrong. And so very carefully, he begins walking down this initial hallway, following the blood trail. And then he turns right into that right hallway and he looks, and he can't believe what he is seeing. It looks like the entire right stretch of hallway was covered in blood. I mean, the floors, the walls, the ceilings, everything. There is blood everywhere. However, there's no person. It looks like all this blood kind of turns right and goes into the door at the end of the right hallway, the break room. And so this man knows, okay, obviously someone is very badly hurt, and whoever is moaning is almost certainly in that break room. And so he calls out again to see if this person will call back to him, but it's silent. And so he walks down this right hallway that's soaked in blood, and he gets to the end and he turns right and he grabs the handle of the break room door. He turns the handle and he pushes the door open. And at first he couldn't quite open it. There was something blocking the door from opening, but finally he kind of muscles it open enough that he can look inside, and he realizes what was blocking the door. There was a young woman lying face down on the ground, and her legs had been blocking the door. And this woman was Jana. And this man, who was not medically trained, immediately understood this woman is deceased. The injuries she has sustained are so bad, there is absolutely no way she is alive. And he immediately thought, she also has likely been dead for some time. This does not look like it just happened. And so he's thinking, who's moaning? Where's the moaning coming from? Is there somebody else in this room? And so he pushes and kind of moves her body out of the way and sticks his head into the break room, and he scans around, but there's no one else in there. But as he's looking around, he hears the moaning again, and he realizes it's coming from the other side of the hallway, at the end of the left hallway. And so he shuts the break room door and he walks back up the hallway to the T intersection. And instead of turning and walking into the main shop, he continues down the left hallway. And he goes all the way down until he's standing in front of the door that leads into the bathroom, and to his left is the door that leads to that kitchen. And as he's standing there, he just kind of yells out, hey, whoever's in here, say something, because he doesn't know what door they're in. And he hears the moaning, and it's coming from the door right in front of him, the bathroom door. And so he opens the bathroom door, and immediately he's struck by all the blood all over the bathroom. And lying on her back on the ground is another young woman. It was Brittany. Her hands were zip tied together and attached to a pipe on the side of the room, and she was covered in blood. There were obvious stab wounds and slash marks and bruises all over her. And at first, this man assumed she must be deceased, and there must be a third person in this bathroom who's doing the moaning. But then he was startled when Brittany made this low, guttural moaning sound, almost like the sound of an animal dying. And he realized that was the moaning he was hearing. It was Brittany. At that moment, the police had arrived. They had rushed inside. They grabbed this man and escorted him out. They secured the scene, and then the paramedics came in, and they would confirm that unfortunately Jana was deceased. And then when they went to Brittany, they found that she was still clinging to life. And so they put her up onto a stretcher and they began wheeling her out. And as she was being brought out of the store, the paramedics began trying to talk to her. And Brittany, amazingly, was able to say a few words. The police, who are also on the scene, they see this, and they're concerned that, she might pass away from her injuries before they get to talk to her. And so sensing she was able to talk, they kind of rushed over as she's being loaded into the ambulance out front, and they would say, hey, do you remember anything about what happened to you and the other woman who was in there? and Brittany was able to tell them that the night before there had been these two men who were wearing all black. They had ski masks on, so they didn't know what they looked like, and they had robbed the store, and then they had sexually assaulted both of the women. But Jana had apparently fought back so fiercely that they had killed her before they left. And so after she tells police this, the ambulance gets shut up and she's taken away to the hospital. And then the police immediately go into the Lululemon store to get the security footage from inside the shop to see if they can get some footage of the attack and see what happened. But unfortunately, the only camera this store had was on the exterior of the back of the building, just kind of looking out at a parking lot. There were no cameras looking in the store or at the front of the store. You have to remember, Bethesda, where the store was located, was considered to be extremely safe, very low crime neighborhood. And so more than likely, that was why the store did not have a security system. And so very frustrated, the police pulled up the only footage they could, which was this exterior camera. And sure enough, the night before, around midnight, the camera picked up two men wearing all black with their hoods up, running away from the store. And so there was really no way to identify who they were. All they could tell was, one was fairly tall, but nonetheless, they pulled the footage and they gave it to the media. And then that day and into the night, the local news played this footage on repeat, asking people in the area to come forward if they know who these two guys are. But by the next day, when the media and the police investigation had turned up nothing on these two guys, the police added a $150,000 reward for any information about who these two guys were. But after 48 hours since the discovery of this crime, still no one had come forward with any meaningful information about who these guys were, and so the police were kind of at a dead end. And so some of the detectives decided to go back to the Lululemon shop to walk the crime scene again to see if maybe something was missed in the initial search. And so the police, they come back to the shop and it's being guarded 24/7 by police at this point. There's yellow crime scene tape outside blocking people off. And so the detectives arrive, they go underneath the yellow tape, they go past the security, they go inside, and then one of the detectives just walks straight to the back of the store and just kind of stands there near the registers looking around. And as he was looking around, he began looking at all of the bloody footprints that were on the ground. Now, by this point, all of the prints had been accounted for except for one set. There was a men's size 14 shoe print that had been spotted in several locations in the store, and it was just kind of assumed that it belonged to one of the killers. The thing about this print was that the treads of this shoe were fairly unique. They had a distinctive and fairly easy to recognize pattern to them. The police knew about this shoe print, but to be honest, they hadn't given it much thought because they felt like the print only seemed to confirm that a relatively tall man had been involved in this crime. But as this one detective stood in the back of the store and was just kind of looking around, he noticed a bin of shoes on the ground in the store. These shoes were there for shoppers to put them on when they were getting their pants hemmed and fitted to them. These shoes were not for sale. They were just kind of random shoes that were there effectively as props to make sure people's clothes fit properly. And the detective noticed one of the shoes at the top of the pile in this bin appeared to be a large men's shoe. And so purely out of curiosity, he reached down and he flipped the shoe over to look at the treads. And to his shock, they were an exact match to the unique treads on the size 14 bloody print. But the shoes he was holding were clean. There was no blood on them. So the detectives, they kind of all converge on the shoe, and they're thinking to themselves, did the attackers come in barefoot and perpetrate this attack with store shoes on and then afterwards clean them and leave them behind? Or is it just a crazy coincidence that one of the attackers happened to have the exact same style shoe and size as the one in this bin? They had no idea, but they felt like this was significant and they needed to get to the bottom of why this kind of random shoe in the store matched this print. And they thought the only person who might have more information about what the killer's shoes looked like would be Brittany. And so at this point, Brittany was still in very rough shape, but she had stabilized to the point where the police felt comfortable speaking to her. And so they paid her a visit and they asked her if she could remember anything about her attacker's feet. Did they wear shoes? And if so, what color were they? Anything she could remember at this point would be helpful. But Brittany would say, no, I'm sorry, I don't remember their feet at all. But there was something about the way she just very quickly dismissed the shoes that tipped the police off that maybe Brittany could be hiding something. But the police didn't press her because they knew she had just been in this horrific attack, and they also didn't really have a good sense of what her normal behavior looked like. So they just thanked her and they left. They were planning to speak to her again the following day, but she actually got in touch with them first and offered to have a meeting to go over what happened. And from the sound of her voice, it just sounded like she was just eager to help them. And so the police, they sat down with Brittany again, and they began talking about what happened and kind of going over the details. And they asked her again about the shoes. And again, she said she just didn't know. And then at some point in this second discussion they're having, Brittany kind of offhandedly mentioned something that she believes is just a small detail. But that small detail would ultimately be the thing that would lead police to figure out what actually happened on the night Jayna was killed. This is what happened. Back on March 11th, 2011, so the night of the attack, Jayna and Brittany were working in the store. It was a normal shift. Everything was fine. And then at closing time, they did their duties. They walked outside. Jayna locked the front door, and then they said their goodbyes and they went their separate ways. Jayna drove off in her car and Brittany began walking to the metro train station. But Brittany realized she had left her wallet in the break room, and so she called Jayna, and Jayna would tell Brittany that it was no big deal because she had left her laptop in the break room. Back at the front of the store, Jayna double parked her car out on the street, and then she and Brittany headed inside the shop. Brittany would lead the way to the break room at the end of the hallway on the right, and after she got her wallet, Brittany would turn around and leave the break room ahead of Jayna to make her way back out to the main shopping area. And so Jayna was only a few seconds behind Brittany. She was just getting her laptop, and then when she had it, she left the break room, she walked down the hallway, and she turned and began walking into the main shopping area as well. And she had her head down. She was just kind of fiddling with her phone and her laptop. But at some point, she realized, even without looking up, that Brittany had come to a full stop in the middle of the shopping area. So Jayna looks up, and there were not two men wearing all black with black ski masks blocking their way to the front door. In fact, there were no men involved in what happened next at all. The two men that had been seen on the security camera in the back of the building were just two cooks who happened to be hustling by the night of the attack and who happened to be wearing all black. It was just a coincidence. But there was someone standing in the store blocking Jayna from leaving. It was Brittany. Brittany was staring at Jayna, and in her hand was a foot-long square metal rod. It was one of the pieces of metal that normally was anchored into the walls of the store to hold up merchandise. Jayna is so caught off guard by this, she has no idea what the issue is. And so she says to Brittany, hey, calm down, we can talk about this. But Brittany was not trying to talk to Jayna. Brittany was trying to silence Jayna, and she had lied about her wallet to lure Jayna back to the store. This was a setup. Earlier that night, during their shift together, Jayna had caught Brittany stuffing a pair of yoga pants into her bag and had confronted her about it. And it's believed Brittany was worried Jayna was going to tell their boss about it the next day and that Brittany would be fired because of it. And then once again, her life would be derailed and she would be humiliated, and Brittany just couldn't have that. And so as Jayna slowly began to back up into the hallway with her hands up, trying to calm Brittany down, Brittany began to advance on her. And as soon as she did, Jayna screamed and turned and ran down that employee hallway. She turned right and bolted down the hallway towards the break room. She grabbed the break room door and she was trying to get it open, but before she could, Brittany had caught up to her and she smashed her over the head with the pipe. Immediately, Jayna turned around, she put her hands up over her head to protect herself, and she begged Brittany not to hit her again. But Brittany wasn't listening. Brittany just wound up and smashed her across the arms with the pipe. Jayna began screaming out and pleading with her to stop, but Brittany just kept on going. And for the next several minutes, Jayna just stood at the end of this hallway in front of the break room door, just trying desperately to protect herself with her hands. But Brittany was so strong and fast, and she kept striking her on her head and on the sides and anywhere else she could land a blow. The blood spatter on the walls of the end of that right hallway would later reveal that Jayna had gradually moved from a standing position down to the fetal position, meaning Brittany had literally beat her until she collapsed on the ground. And when Jayna hit the ground, she must have known she was trapped. There was no escape route for her, and she was so badly wounded that even if there was a way to go, Brittany was going to catch up to her and Brittany was going to stop her. And so Jayna just began quietly begging for her life. But Brittany had other plans for her. At the end of that right hallway that they were both in, Brittany had noticed a red toolbox was on the ground in the corner. And so around the time Jana had fallen to the ground and was begging for her life, Brittany dropped the metal pipe and she casually opened the toolbox, revealing screwdrivers, nails, wrenches, hammers, all sorts of tools. And one by one, Brittany began reaching into this toolbox, taking out a tool, and then smashing, cutting, slashing, and beating Jana with it. It would take Brittany roughly 10 minutes to cycle through every single tool in that toolbox. But shockingly, despite being dealt 330 significant wounds, Jana was still alive and she was still pleading for her life. Frustrated, Brittany stood up, she chucked the tools on the ground, she turned around and she walked down the hallway all the way to the kitchen at the other end of that left hallway. She went inside and she grabbed a large knife. Then she marched back into the hallway. She went straight down all the way to Jana. Jana is still begging for her life, and Brittany just reaches down. She grabs her hair with her left hand and pulls her head forward towards her. Then she takes the knife with her right hand. She raises it up and she brings it smashing down into the back of Jana's skull. The knife would pierce her skull, it would pierce her brain, and that would be the killing blow. Once Jana was deceased, Brittany simply got to work, staging the store to look like a robbery gone wrong. The first thing she did was drag Jana's body out of the hallway and into the break room. And then once the door was shut, she headed out to the front of the store and just walked straight outside and climbed into Jana's car that was still double parked outside. And she drove that around the block to a parking lot. And then when she got back inside of the shop, she went to that bin of shoes used for fitting pants. And she took out the size 14 men's shoe, she put them on her feet, and then she began walking around in the pool of blood underneath Jana in the right hallway and began tracking the bloody prints all over the store to make it appear like a man was involved in the attack. And then after cleaning the shoes, she ransacked the store, and then she grabbed a knife and a screwdriver and she headed into the bathroom where she repeatedly stabbed and slashed herself before tying her hands and her feet with zip ties. At 8 a.m. the next morning, she was discovered. The seemingly small piece of information that Brittany kind of accidentally gave to police during that second meeting, this piece of information that kind of broke the case, that came when the police asked her if she knew what kind of car Jana drove or if she'd ever been inside of Jana's car. And Brittany would say, "No, I don't know what it looks like and I've never been inside of it." But a couple of days later, when Jana's car would be found and the police would search it, they would find Brittany's hair and DNA all over it. So they knew Brittany had been lying to them. And so this is what ultimately led to Brittany's arrest, and she would later be convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please deliver a box of Girl Scout cookies to the 5-star review button. But before you hand them over, eat them all and replace them with stale saltines. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, iTunes, Google, Amazon, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can send me a message on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is just @MrBallen. And yes, I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. Until next time, see ya. In mid-July 1977, a 38-year-old woman named Remy Chua was sitting in her living room talking to her husband when suddenly, mid-sentence, she stood up and said very robotically that she was going to go lie down for a while. Then she turned and walked away into a nearby bedroom. Sensing something was off with his wife, the husband got up and followed her. What he would see and hear in that bedroom over the next 30 minutes would not only scar him for life, but would also become some of the most infamous evidence ever used by police in a real murder investigation. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week. once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please ask the 5-star review button to play a game of Call of Duty with you, but just camp the entire time. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was 3 p.m. on Monday, February 21st, 1977, and Teresita Basa was feeling happy that her shift at North Chicago's Edgewater Hospital was over. She smiled and said goodbye to a couple of her coworkers as she closed her locker and shrugged into her winter coat. It was winter in Chicago, which meant the days were very cold and very short. That day, the sunset was barely after 5 p.m. But with her shift ending at 3 p.m., she'd be home by 4 p.m., which meant she'd still have a full hour of daylight before darkness fell over her adopted city. Already looking forward to that magical hour inside of her cozy 4-bedroom apartment, the slender 47-year-old woman from the Philippines made her way out onto the street and walked to the nearby elevated train station. A few minutes later, a train arrived and Teresita climbed on board. It wasn't rush hour, so there were plenty of seats to choose from. She found one she liked, and she sat down right as the train began pulling out of the station. After putting her bag on the seat next to her, she turned around in her seat and put her fingertips against the window behind her, and even through her glove, she could feel how cold the glass was. Despite having lived in the United States for almost 15 years, there were times, especially in the winter, when she still felt surprised by how completely different Chicago was when compared to her hometown of Dumaguete, a city located 8,000 miles away on Negros Island in the southern Philippines. Here in Chicago, Teresita was surrounded by towering skyscrapers, and the average temperature in February hovered right around freezing. Back in Dumaguete, nicknamed the City of Gentle People, the temperature in February was hot, and the landscape was green and lush with lots of graceful Spanish-style architecture. But much as Teresita sometimes missed the Philippines and her family who still lived there, she was sure that if she had not come to the US, she never would have had a chance to achieve her dream. A dream that right now, Teresita felt was almost within her grasp. Much as she liked it, her current job as a respiratory therapist at the hospital was really just a means to an end, a way to pay her rent and to afford her beautiful piano that waited for her in her living room at home. She liked working with the patients, diagnosing and analyzing lung function, and then helping the doctors create treatment plans and prescribe interventions and medications. But this job was not why Teresita had left her home in the Philippines and come to America. She had come to America to pursue her lifelong passion, music. As a young child, Teresita begged her parents for piano lessons, and when they relented and let her have piano lessons, she was over the moon and played piano basically all the time. And when she wasn't playing the piano, she was marching around her home, humming along to the notes of the music in her head. Once Teresita had finished high school, she had been among the very small percent of women in her town at that time, it was the late 1940s, early 1950s, to go on to university in the Philippines' capital city of Manila. And after graduating from there, Teresita became part of an even smaller percentage of women who went on to get their master's degree. This time, Teresita would leave the Philippines to attend Indiana University in the United States. By the time she was enrolled at Indiana University, Teresita had decided that she would become a music teacher, not a concert pianist, which had been her original intended career path in music. Although when she got to Chicago, she would become a member of a very serious musical band called the Five Mahoganies Plus One that performed for large paying crowds. After getting her master's degree in Indiana, Teresita had moved north to Chicago, where she got her job at the hospital, and she enrolled at Chicago's Loyola University to get her doctorate in music. Her hope was that afterward, she would be hired by Loyola University and would become a professor of music, thereby fulfilling her dream. As the train she was on rattled down the tracks, inside her gloved hand pressing against the window, Teresita could feel the beautiful pearl cocktail ring her mother had given her the last time she had come to visit in Chicago. The ring had been a gift to Teresita's mother from Teresita's father, a wealthy judge, who had bought the jewelry for his wife while visiting France. Before returning to Dumaguete after that last visit, Teresita's mother had pressed the ring, along with a heavy jade pendant and a few other pieces of jewelry, into her daughter's hands, telling Teresita to wear them, and when she did, to think of her parents and how much they loved her. Teresita was an only child, and she knew full well just how much her mother and father had hoped she would return to the Philippines. Teresita understood that this gift of jewelry was her mother's way of telling her that her parents had finally accepted Teresita's decision to stay in the United States. Even though her mother's eyes had been filled with tears when she gave the jewelry to her daughter, Teresita knew how proud her parents were of her accomplishments and her determination to be self-sufficient and independent. As the train finally came to a stop at the station, located just 4 blocks from her apartment building, Teresita grabbed her bag and then pulled her coat tight around her. She stood up and then headed out the train doors into the cold. By the time she reached her apartment building, Teresita had already planned out how she would spend her evening. She would practice piano, and then she would spend some time on her doctoral thesis and on the book she was writing about music composition and theory. She was also hoping to call a few people who might be interested in buying tickets to the next performance of her band, the 5 Mahoganies Plus One, and maybe she'd give her cousin a call too. Her cousin had actually also immigrated to the Chicago area from the Philippines, and so the two often chatted on the phone, enjoying a rare chance to speak in their native tongue, Tagalog. After getting off the elevator on the 15th floor, Teresita turned and began walking down the hallway toward her apartment, which was number 15B. Once she reached her door, she unlocked it with her key, she stepped inside, and she closed the door behind her. She took off her winter coat and hung it neatly in her closet. Then she took off her mother's pearl ring and carefully placed it next to her mother's jade necklace, which was on top of the dresser in her bedroom. After freshening up in the bathroom, Teresita went into her living room and she sat down at her beloved piano. As she ran her fingers across the keys, she looked out the nearby window and was happy to still see sunlight. With a smile on her face, she turned back to her piano, she closed her eyes, and she began to play. A few hours later, at around 8 p.m. that evening, Teresita heard a quiet knock on her front door. She set aside the work she had been doing on her doctoral thesis and walked toward the front of her apartment. When she reached the door, she called out, "Who's there?" When she got the answer, Teresita smiled, undid the lock and deadbolt, and then invited her guest inside. 1 hour later, at 9 p.m., the first fire engine screeched to a halt in front of Teresita's apartment building. The crowd of residents and curious bystanders gathered in front of the building scattered as firefighters jumped down from the truck and headed inside up the stairs to the 15th floor. 20 minutes earlier, the building's janitor had called 911 to report that residents had smelled and seen smoke coming out from under the door of apartment 15B. And sure enough, when firefighters arrived on the 15th floor, they saw thick curls of smoke pouring out from under that apartment door into the hallway. The janitor ran up and used his key to unlock 15B's door before turning and running back down the hall to the stairwell. With the door unlocked, the firefighters made entry. Inside apartment 15B, firefighters quickly saw and extinguished the source of the fire. It was a burning mattress on the floor of the bedroom, and near it was a pile of burning clothes. Once a thorough search revealed that the apartment was empty of any people, a fire department lieutenant used his boot to kick aside the smoldering pile of clothes, trying to see what might have caused the fire. Crowding in behind the lieutenant were a couple of uniformed police officers who had also arrived at the scene. And when those police officers and the lieutenant saw what was under those smoldering clothes, they instantly stepped back and turned their faces aside. Then, one of the police officers grabbed his radio and called for medical personnel, homicide detectives, and a crime scene unit. The first thing Chicago detective Joe Stachula and his partner Lee Eppen noticed when they stepped inside of Teresita's apartment was the mess. Looking into the kitchen, they could see drawers had been pulled out and cupboards were open, and in the living room, lamps had been knocked over and a coffee table overturned. But even though they were preparing for something much worse when they stepped into Teresita's bedroom, what they actually saw still stunned them. In front of them, lying on her back on the floor next to the bed, was the body of a woman. The fire had burned most of the dark wavy hair from her head, along with most of the skin on the right side of her face. She was naked, Her knees were spread wide apart, but her feet were almost touching each other. Her arms were out to either side, bent upwards at the elbows, so her hands were near her head. And in the very center of her chest was a large kitchen knife, buried into her torso right up to the wooden hilt. It did not take detectives long to confirm that the body in 15B was that of Teresita Basa. And based on the condition of her body and the disorder inside of her apartment, it also didn't take investigators long to come up with a working theory of what happened to her. Since the door to her apartment was not deadbolted from the inside, police assumed that Teresita had opened the door for her killer. And once the killer, who they believed was male, was inside, he overpowered Teresita, he sexually assaulted her, and then he murdered her. After she was dead, he ransacked her apartment looking for valuables, and then before leaving, he tried to burn her body to destroy any incriminating evidence. But when the autopsy report came back a few days later, this working theory fell apart. According to the medical examiner, not only was there no evidence of sexual assault, it turned out that Teresita was actually a virgin. So, with this new information, the police now knew that Teresita's body had been staged to look like a sexual assault had taken place. The killer, who they now knew could easily have been a man or a woman, likely was just trying to confuse police. As for the robbery angle, the police had no way of knowing if anything was actually taken from apartment 15B because Teresita lived there alone, and so only Teresita would have known if something was missing. And while the fire had been relatively small and mostly contained to just Teresita's bedroom, it had been big enough that it completely destroyed any evidence of fingerprints on the murder weapon. Additionally, interviews with Teresita's neighbors, co-workers, family, friends, university professors, supervisors, and possible love interests all led to one dead end after another. While Teresita occasionally entertained male visitors and went out on a few dates, there did not appear to be any serious boyfriends in her life. 10 years earlier, Teresita had fallen in love with a man from Chicago, but on a trip home to the Philippines to meet her family, the man had turned up drunk and naked in the city's red light district with a teenage girl on his lap. Ever since then, Teresita had become much more interested in friendship than in romance. As a result, there was no sign of some of the more obvious murder motives like jealousy, affairs, marital problems, or sexual entanglements. And when it came to identifying possible suspects at Edgewood Medical Center, the hospital itself was so big, with hundreds of employees working various schedules in dozens of different departments, and hundreds more visitors and visiting medical personnel, that detectives had to narrow their interviews to just co-workers whose shifts and responsibilities overlapped with Teresita's. And the verdict among that small group was unanimous. Everybody loved Teresita. She was kind, she was quiet but friendly, she was great with her patients, she was good at her job, she was reliable, punctual, hardworking, and at lunch in the cafeteria, she liked to eat alone, always sitting in the same place, humming bars of music in between bites of her food. Teresita's neighbors on the 15th floor of her apartment building didn't have anything to add either. They said Teresita did periodically have guests at her apartment, but on the night of her murder, no one on the floor had seen anyone enter or leave Teresita's apartment. By the end of April, 6 weeks after Teresita's murder, detectives Stachula and Eppen had gotten virtually nowhere on the case. However, they did have two viable leads. The first lead had to do with a phone call Teresita received on the night of her murder. Teresita's friend, Ruth Loeb, called her around 7:30 p.m., and the two women chatted for about 20 minutes. Ruth would tell the detectives that on this call, Teresita mentioned that she was going to have a visitor over that night, and Ruth would recall actually hearing a man's voice in the background of Teresita's apartment toward the end of their phone call. However, Teresita didn't say who this male visitor was, and Ruth didn't recognize the voice. 1 hour after Ruth and Teresita hung up their phones, authorities would discover Teresita's body. This meant Teresita had been killed right after her call with Ruth. This also meant that Teresita's unknown male visitor that night had most likely been her killer. The second lead detectives had was a cryptic note that Teresita had written in her personal diary. It just said, "Buy tickets for A.S." But to that point, police had not come across anyone or heard of any friend or acquaintance of Teresita's with the initials AS, so they had no idea who this AS person was. But despite these promising leads, detectives continued to hit dead end after dead end in their investigation. And so by the summer of 1977, Teresita's murder seemed destined to go unsolved. However, that would not be the case, because something incredibly unusual and downright disturbing was about to happen that would lead the detectives to the killer. Not long after Teresita's murder, one of the other respiratory therapists at Edgewater Hospital began to act very strangely. Her name was Remy Chua, she was 38 years old, and like Teresita, she was from the Philippines. Remy didn't work the same shift as Teresita, and so she had very little interaction with her and didn't know her well. But, according to Remy's co-workers, following Teresita's death, Remy began using Teresita's locker at work, and she also began to sit in the exact same seat in the cafeteria that Teresita would always sit at. Remy even began to hum as she sat there alone and ate her lunch, just like Teresita had. Remy also began to talk at length about a brand new interest she had, music. Unsettled by what they considered to be Remy's obvious impersonation of a murdered colleague, Remy's co-workers eventually asked her why she was doing what she was doing. But Remy just looked at them confused and then waved them off dismissively and said she was not acting like Teresita, she was acting like herself. Eventually, when Remy's behavior didn't stop, a few of her co-workers complained to their supervisor. And when the supervisor approached Remy and told her about her co-workers' complaints, Remy became furious and aggressive. And in fact, her outburst got so out of hand that the supervisor wound up firing her. When Remy arrived home that day, she was still very upset. Her husband, Dr. Jose Chua, who was a surgeon in Chicago, not at Edgewater but at another hospital, instantly noticed that his wife looked distraught. So he asked her to come sit down with him and tell him what was wrong. So Remy walked into the living room, she sat down in a chair, and then she began to tell her husband a sort of distorted version of what had happened. She told her husband not that she was just fired, but rather that her job had just been canceled, and so now she was out of work. Remy didn't mention anything about her mimicry of Teresita Basa and how that had actually led to her job loss. Now, at this point in the story, you need to understand that Dr. Chua had no idea that there were any strange things happening with his wife. She seemed totally normal to him up until she had come home upset. Also, at this point, Dr. Chua had never heard the name Teresita Basa before. He had no idea who she was, or that she had worked with his wife at the hospital, or that she had recently been killed. So, when Dr. Chua's wife suddenly stood up from her chair in the living room mid-sentence and just said kind of robotically that she was going to go lie down for a while, Dr. Chua had no idea that he and his wife were about to get drawn into one of the most bizarre and unlikely murder investigations in American history. After Remy stood up and left for her bedroom, her mother, who was visiting the couple, would say that the look on her daughter's face was so strange that she turned and asked Dr. Chua to follow her and make sure his wife was okay. Dr. Chua did just that, and he arrived in the bedroom to find his wife lying on top of the bed, staring blankly up at the ceiling. Startled by the fixed look on his wife's face, Dr. Chua sat down next to her on the edge of the bed and asked her, "Is anything wrong?" But the voice that answered him did not belong to his wife. It was instead a voice he had never heard before. It spoke in the native Philippine language of Tagalog, which he and his wife both knew but rarely used, and the voice spoke with a distinct Spanish accent that he had never heard his wife use before. "Doctor," the voice coming out of his wife's mouth said, "you must help me." Dr. Chua was so caught off guard by this alien-sounding voice that he immediately defaulted to his medical training. He decided he needed to check to see if his wife was actually coherent or not, so he asked her a simple question: "What is your name?" But instead of his wife saying Remy in her normal voice, she said, still speaking in Tagalog with a Spanish accent, "I am Teresita Basa." Dr. Chua felt chills go all over his body. Then, after a pause, he said that he didn't know anyone by that name. When his wife just lay there motionless, still staring up at the ceiling, Dr. Chua broke the silence and said, "Well, what do you want?" The voice responded immediately. She said she had been murdered and she wanted to tell the doctor the name of her killer. Dr. Chua was at a complete loss. Nothing in his medical training had prepared him for what he was experiencing. And so he just started stroking his wife's arm and telling her that everything was okay and to relax and that she needed to wake up now and come back to him. But as he tried to kind of calm his wife down, the voice coming out of her mouth only became more insistent. It told Dr. Chua the first and last name of her killer. Then the voice gave very specific details of her own murder. The voice said that her killer had arrived alone at her apartment around 8 p.m. on the night of Monday, February 21st, and that she, Teresita, had let him in because he was a friend. But this friend, once inside of her apartment, had stabbed Teresita and killed her. In all, Remy's apparent trance lasted for about 30 minutes. When she came to, she began glancing around the room wildly when she saw her husband sitting on the bed next to her looking gravely concerned, and her mother standing in the corner looking horrified. Remy asked, "What's going on?" Dr. Chua gently asked his wife if she remembered anything that had just happened. Puzzled, Remy shook her head no and said that the last thing she remembered was sitting in the chair in the living room, and that she had no idea how she got to this bedroom. Dr. Chua, who was very rattled by what he had just experienced, took a deep breath and then tried to explain to his wife everything that had just happened in that bedroom. When Dr. Chua asked Remy if she knew this woman, Teresita Basa, Remy, who was now visibly shaking, told her husband that she did. Teresita was a woman she worked with at the hospital and that she had just been killed. But Remy said she barely knew her, they were just acquaintances. However, as she told her husband this, Remy suddenly remembered something that happened to her 2 weeks earlier that she had tried to forget about, but now she couldn't help but bring it up. Remy said 2 weeks earlier, she had gone into the break room at the hospital after a long shift to take a nap, and just seconds after closing her eyes, she felt a presence in the room with her. Thinking one of her coworkers must have silently stepped into the room, she was horrified when she opened her eyes, and there, standing right in front of her, staring down at her, was the recently murdered Teresita Basa. Remy was so instantly terrified that without making a sound, she just leapt to her feet and ran out of the room and down the hallway. After a few seconds, she stopped running and she turned around, but Teresita wasn't there anymore. With her heart still pounding, Remy told herself that she must have just imagined seeing Teresita, that was all just a dream. But she couldn't shake the image of Teresita standing there staring at her. It felt so real. Terrified and embarrassed, she had decided not to tell anyone about seeing the ghost of Teresita until now. After hearing the story, Dr. Chua told his wife that, of course, that must have just been a dream. Don't worry about that. I'm sure that's nothing. But deep down, he was frightened too, and couldn't understand how that could have happened just 2 weeks ago, and now they're in this bedroom dealing with this trance scenario that involves Teresita. Shifting the conversation back to reality, Dr. Chua asked his wife if she recognized the name of Teresita's killer. The voice had repeated the name several times, and Remy would say yes, she did know who that person was. But ultimately, the Chuas decided that they could not possibly go to the police with any of this information. How could they explain to police how they got it? They'd look foolish or crazy or even suspicious. So the couple just kind of went on with their day and acted like Remy's trance had never happened. Then, that night, Remy got a telephone call. Dr. Chua, who was standing nearby when his wife answered, could hear a man's voice on the other end of the line. His wife only managed to say a few words before hanging up the receiver, but when she turned back to her husband, her face was pale. She told him that it was someone from work whose voice she didn't recognize, but the man had just threatened her and told her that he was, quote, going to get her next. Again, out of fear, the Chuas decided not to go to police. 2 days later, while Remy was on the phone talking to a real estate agent standing near where her husband was sitting, Remy suddenly dropped the telephone receiver and stood awkwardly still and went into another trance. Again, the voice that came out of Remy's mouth was not her own. It was the voice that claimed to be Teresita. And this time, the voice was even more insistent. "You must help me, doctor," she pleaded. "You are the only one who can help find my killer. You must go to the police with everything I've told you." The voice went on to tell Dr. Chua not to be afraid, that he would not get in trouble for coming forward with this information, that Teresita would protect him and his family. However, once Remy snapped out of this second trance, the Chuas again did not go to the police. Even though they were starting to believe that these trances might actually be real, that Teresita really was communicating with them from beyond the grave, they felt like they didn't have any real evidence to back up what this voice was claiming, and so they still just could not go to police. No one would believe them. A few days later, Remy would fall into yet another trance. While Remy and her husband were asleep in bed, Remy suddenly opened her eyes, and while remaining stiff as a board on her back, she began speaking to Dr. Chua in the now familiar Tagalog with the Spanish inflection. When Dr. Chua woke up and saw what was happening right next to him, he was ready. He demanded that the voice provide real proof that could confirm her claim about the killer's identity, and the voice would do just that. According to the voice, after Teresita had let her killer inside of her apartment, the killer had knocked her unconscious, and after stabbing her, he had rifled through her apartment and taken several pieces of jewelry that had been given to her by her mother. Her killer had disposed of some of the pieces, but he had kept a jade and gold necklace and a pearl cocktail ring that he had given to his longtime girlfriend with whom he lived. Not only did the voice describe every detail of the ring and the necklace, but also the voice told Dr. Chua the names and the phone numbers of Teresita's relatives who lived in the Chicago area who could actually identify this jewelry as belonging to Teresita. The voice ended the trance by telling Dr. Chua that once police found this jewelry, they would find the killer. After this third visitation from what appeared to be the spirit of Teresita, Dr. Chua and Remy felt like they had to share this information with authorities. But the Chuas were still nervous about going public with their story, so instead of contacting the Chicago police, they contacted their own local police department in Evanston, Illinois, which was north of Chicago. And instead of saying that they had got all this information from the voice of a dead woman, they told the police that Remy had received that threatening phone call from a former co-worker at Edgewater Hospital, and they identified this co-worker using the name of the man that the voice, Teresita, had said was her murderer. The Chuas then surprised the Evanston police by suggesting that this threatening phone call could be related to the murder of Teresita Basa. It should be noted that we don't know if Remy and Dr. Chua concocted this story in order to more discreetly tell police what they had learned from the voice, or if they actually came to believe that the person who called Remy and threatened her was the same person who the voice identified as the killer. So, in early August 1977, 5 months after Teresita's death, Chicago detective Joe Stachula was notified by Evanston police about a possible tip in the Teresita murder case. A few days later, when Detective Stachula followed up directly with the Evanston police for more details on this tip, the Evanston police officer told Stachula the name the Chuas had given them of the man who had apparently made this harassing phone call and who the Chuas thought was connected to the murder of Teresita Basa. And when Detective Stachula heard this person's name, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up straight. A few days after that, Detective Stachula found himself sitting in the Chua's living room, staring at a highly educated and articulate couple who seemed incredibly reluctant to elaborate in any way on the tip they had called in to the Evanston police station. After a brief description from Remy about the threatening call she had received almost 3 weeks earlier, Detective Stachula could no longer ignore Dr. Chua's obvious distress as the doctor sat there shifting in his seat and wringing his hands while his wife was speaking. When Detective Stachula turned towards the doctor and asked him point blank, "Is there something about this murder investigation that you want to tell me?" Dr. Chua looked extremely embarrassed, but instead of answering the detective's question, the surgeon leaned forward and looked intently at the detective's face before asking a question of his own. "Do you believe in the occult or in possession and exorcism?" Detective Stachula worded his answer carefully, telling Dr. Chua that as a homicide investigator, he always tried to keep an open mind and follow up on any information that could help solve a murder case. Dr. Chua nodded silently, then took a deep breath and he told the detective the whole story of how, starting back in mid-July, the spirit of Teresita Basa had begun temporarily possessing his wife's body. And during these possessions, Teresita would give them very specific information, like about the exact type of jewelry that was taken from her apartment, that Teresita insisted would help police catch her killer, a man named Alan Showery. When Detective Stachula had first heard the Evanston police officer say this name, Alan Showery, it had caused the hairs on his neck to stand up because Alan's initials were A.S., just like the initials written in that cryptic note Teresita had left in her personal diary before she was killed. The note had just said, "Buy tickets for A.S." When Detective Stachula asked the couple if they knew anything about this Alan Showery person, Remy said Alan was a 31-year-old respiratory technician at Edgewater Hospital and he was friends with Teresita. However, it would turn out he was one of the employees at the hospital who was not originally interviewed by police because his shifts did not overlap with Teresita's. While the information that Dr. Chua and Remy had just told him sounded very promising, the fact that it was apparently delivered by the murder victim herself after she was dead seemed so unbelievable to Detective Stachula that instead of writing up a formal police report about his interview with the Chuas, he instead just described the interview in a confidential memo that he sent only to his commanding officer. Following the Chua interview, police would rule out Remy and her husband, Dr. Chua, as suspects in Teresita's murder because both of them had rock-solid alibis. The police would also run a background check on Alan Showery, and it would show that he had a lengthy rap sheet, which included being arrested for, but not convicted of, theft, burglary, and rape. Through new interviews with Teresita's co-workers, police confirmed that Alan and Teresita were friends and that on the night of her murder, Alan may have gone to Teresita's apartment to fix her broken TV set, because apparently someone had overheard him say that. And if that was true, that would place him right at the scene of the crime. So, on the afternoon of August 11th, 1977, almost 6 months after Teresita was killed, Detectives Stachula and Eppin arrived at the apartment of Alan and his girlfriend Yanka and asked to speak with Alan down at the police station about Teresita's murder. While Alan immediately agreed to the request and chatted to detectives on the ride to the station about what a wonderful person and good friend Teresita had been, he also insisted to police that the last time he had seen Teresita was 6 months before her death. But when investigators bluffed, telling him they'd found his fingerprints at Teresita's apartment, Alan reconsidered, saying that on second thought, he had been at Teresita's apartment on the night of her murder to fix her TV, but that he had left at 6:30 p.m. because he didn't have the right tools with him to fix the TV. At that point, police went back to Alan's apartment to see if Yanka could confirm her husband's alibi. But it wasn't what Yanka had to say that grabbed officers' attention. It was what she was wearing. There, on one of her fingers, officers saw a large, distinctive pearl cocktail ring. It was exactly like the one that the Chuas said belonged to Teresita and had been taken from her apartment by the killer. When investigators asked Yanka where she had gotten the ring, she told them it was a late Christmas present, along with some other pieces of jewelry that Alan had given her in late February, which would have been right around the time that Teresita was murdered. Detectives immediately asked Yanka to join her husband at the police station and to bring her jewelry collection with her. Yanka agreed, and then police, using the list of names and phone numbers that Dr. Chua had given them, contacted some of Teresita's relatives who lived in the area, and they came to the police station as well. And those relatives, including Teresita's cousin, immediately identified the ring Yanka was wearing and the jade pendant in her jewelry box as the jewelry that Teresita's father had bought in France for Teresita's mother, and that Teresita's mother had then given the jewelry to Teresita during her last visit to Chicago. When police confronted Alan with the ring, along with the information provided by Teresita's relatives, Alan abandoned his claim that he was innocent of any involvement in Teresita's murder, and by early the next morning, on August 12, 1977, police had a 13-page signed confession from Alan. According to that confession and additional interviews from Teresita's co-workers, this is what happened to Teresita on the night of her murder. Alan arrived at Teresita's apartment at about 6:30 p.m. to fix her TV. But after realizing he did not have the right tools to fix it, he told Teresita that he would just have to come back another time, and he left her apartment shortly after 7:30 p.m. to walk back to his own apartment, which was only a block away. On that walk home, Allen did a lot of thinking. He had some serious money problems. He was currently behind on rent, and if he couldn't get his hands on a lot of cash very soon, his landlord was going to evict him and Yanka, who was several months pregnant. And when Allen wondered where and how he could come up with that kind of money, he thought of Teresita. He knew she came from a wealthy family in the Philippines, and it seemed to him that she must have a lot of cash on hand. So when Yanka went out shopping at about 8 p.m. that night, Allen decided to go back to Teresita's and rob her. When Teresita heard that knock on her front door at about 8 p.m., she was sitting at her table, busy working on her doctoral thesis. When she heard Allen's voice on the other side of the door, saying he'd come back with the right repair tools, she quickly undid the deadbolt to welcome him inside. As she turned back to close the door behind him, Allen lunged at Teresita, using his arm to encircle her neck from behind in a vicious chokehold as he dragged her into her bedroom. He continued to squeeze her neck until she was unconscious. Then Allen lay Teresita down on the bedroom floor on her back. He stripped off all of her clothes and arranged her body to look like she had been sexually assaulted. Then he walked into the kitchen and he grabbed a large knife that was laying on a cutting board nearby. He walked back into the bedroom with the knife in hand, and he stood over Teresita, who was still on the ground unconscious, and then he raised the knife into the air and then drove it straight down into the center of her chest. After pausing to catch his breath and to make sure that Teresita was dead, Allen got back onto his feet and began searching the apartment for the small fortune in cash that he was sure he would find. In the end, though, after pulling out drawers, opening cupboards, and turning over small pieces of furniture, all Allen would find was just $30. Glancing at his watch, Allen knew Yanka would be back soon, and he needed to hurry. So he stepped to Teresita's bed, he pulled the mattress down on top of her to hide her body, and then he piled her clothes up on top of and next to the mattress and set it all on fire. On his way out of her bedroom, he gathered up the jewelry that he found on top of her bedroom dresser and inside her small jewelry box. Then he let himself out the front door and slipped down the hallway to the elevator and then back out to the street where he breathed in fresh, cold winter air. In his confession, Allen was convinced that Teresita never felt a thing after she lost consciousness, meaning she did not feel the knife being plunged into her chest that killed her. However, we have no way of knowing if that's actually true. 17 months after Teresita's murder, on Friday, January 27, 1979, the judge overseeing the Allen Showery murder trial declared a mistrial when the jury of 8 men and 4 women reported that they were hopelessly deadlocked and unable to reach a unanimous verdict of either guilty or not guilty. The trial itself, dubbed the Voice from the Grave trial, had been an 8-day-long national media sensation, with Allen's defense team calling into question any charge that was based on information delivered to police by Teresita's ghost. The prosecution argued that the source of the information that police got from the Chuas was immaterial. The only thing that mattered was whether the information was accurate. And even though Allen would later recant both his oral and written confessions, police said that the hard evidence they had collected proved that he was, in fact, Teresita's killer. Allen's lawyers were ecstatic when the judge declared a mistrial. They had poked so many holes in the Voice from the Dead story that they told Allen that he was sure to get a not guilty verdict in his new trial. They had also proved that Remy was an unreliable witness, that she had, in fact, known Teresita much better than she had originally told detectives, maybe even well enough to know details about what jewelry Teresita owned and the names of Teresita's relatives. But 3 weeks later, on February 22, 1979, almost 2 years to the day that Teresita was killed, Allen Showery surprised the world by changing his story yet again. This time, against the advice of his legal team, Allen changed his plea to guilty in the murder of Teresita Basa. Allen Showery was sentenced to 14 years in prison, the minimum mandatory sentence for murder. But just 4.5 years into Allen's sentence, he was released from prison on parole for good behavior. His whereabouts today are unknown. 45 years later, the case of Teresita Basa's murder remains one of the strangest investigations in police history. But whether or not you believe the story Dr. Jose Chua and his wife Remy told Chicago police, the fact remains that the information they provided to investigators turned out to be the key to finding and convicting the man who eventually confessed to being Teresita's killer. Also, as a final piece of information to think about, buried in the interview notes amongst the dozens and dozens of interviews police conducted with Edgewater Hospital employees, there are 3 different accounts from employees who all claim the same thing, that they came face to face with an apparition that looked like Teresita, who pleaded with them to help bring her killer to justice. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the 5-star review button to play a game of Call of Duty with you, but just camp the entire time. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all platforms is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On March 22, 2003, a highly intelligent, very successful couple decided to play a game. The game was very involved and required handcuffs and blindfolds and heavy chairs, but once they were in position, the couple got the hang of it quickly and thought it was kind of fun. But after playing for a little while, something very unexpected happened, and before either of them could comprehend it, a scream filled the apartment. Then there was silence. This story is a wild ride with one of the strangest conclusions we've ever covered on this show, so make sure you stick around to the end. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please tell the 5-star review button that you'd love to go to their dance recital, but show up to it in disguise so they don't recognize you and have to spend their whole performance searching the crowd in vain for you. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was May 2000, and at the age of 32, Sheila Davalu was on her way up in the world. Tall and elegant, with thick black curly hair and a wide smile, Sheila had just landed a new and highly paid job with Purdue Pharmaceutical Company in Stamford, Connecticut. At that time, Purdue Pharma was one of the most successful drug companies in the United States, and so they were only hiring the best and brightest applicants. And Sheila was certainly that. She was absolutely brilliant and held an undergraduate degree in biochemistry as well as a master's degree in public health. But it wasn't just work that was going well in Sheila's life. On May 28th, shortly after she started her new job at Purdue Pharma, managing the company's medical coding department, Sheila got married to her longtime boyfriend, 32-year-old Paul Christos. Paul was just as brilliant as Sheila, having earned several college degrees, including 2 advanced science degrees from New York Medical College, which is located about 40 minutes outside of New York City. And it was while Paul was studying at New York Medical College in 1994 that he met Sheila. She was also studying at the prestigious school. Sheila had joined a small private study group that Paul was leading to help pay his college tuition bills, and quickly the pair realized they had a lot in common. Both of them were extremely smart and well-educated, they both loved science and research, and they both were living with their parents at the time. Paul's mom and dad lived about 20 minutes away in White Plains, New York. Sheila's family lived a little farther north in the wealthy enclave of Yorktown Heights, where the median income was a whopping $100,000. Paul would later say that when he first saw Sheila in his study group, he was instantly attracted to her. There was something exotic about her dark eyes and olive complexion, and he loved the tiny gap between her two front teeth. Paul was also impressed that Sheila spoke French and Italian as well as English. Within a few weeks of meeting each other at the study group, Paul and Sheila started spending more time with each other outside of the group. At first, they were just friends who enjoyed talking with each other and going on walks, but by the time Sheila graduated with her master's degree in 1998, the couple had fallen in love and gotten engaged. The pair wed on May 28th of 2000, right around the time Sheila landed her new job with Purdue Pharma. The wedding had gone off exactly as Sheila had planned, a small celebration with just 70 members of their family and friends. And afterward, the couple returned to the beautiful condo Sheila's parents had recently purchased for them in the upscale little town of Pleasantville, New York, just 40 minutes away from Purdue Pharma in Stamford. The only person who had been missing from the wedding was Sheila's younger and very mentally unstable brother, who suffered from severe schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a mental illness that can cause episodes of psychosis, delusions, and paranoia. In fact, at Sheila's discretion, her family had not even told her brother that she was getting married. Sheila spent a lot of time with her brother, and she was concerned that if her brother found out that she was married, he might worry that she was going to abandon him. And so, in order to protect her brother, Sheila had said it was important that he didn't meet or see Paul until she and her family were certain he could handle it. And Sheila said that might actually never happen. But as strange as this was, Paul wasn't that concerned. He figured in time he would surely get a chance to meet his brother-in-law and that everything would be fine. So the newly married couple settled into their new life together in their new condo, excited to spend more time together. But pretty much right away, they both got sucked into their respective careers and other interests, and so they actually didn't see each other very much. By September 2000, just 4 months after he and Sheila got married, Paul had started work on another advanced degree, this time a doctorate in epidemiology at Columbia University in New York City. Epidemiology is the study of how often diseases occur in different groups of people and why. In addition to his own studies, Paul was also teaching undergraduate classes 2 evenings a week at Columbia. Meanwhile, Sheila, who was just as ambitious as her husband, threw herself into her new job at Purdue Pharma. She also joined a local volleyball league in order to stay in shape. Neither Paul nor Sheila were ever big socializers or drinkers, but Sheila, in an effort to make some friends at work, had begun joining some of her coworkers at a local bar in the evenings after work. But most nights after work, Sheila preferred to just come home and curl up with a romance novel or watch her favorite TV show, a romance comedy called Friends. Paul would often find his wife fast asleep with a book next to her in bed or on the couch when he came home late from teaching his classes. By spring of 2001, almost a year after she had started at Purdue Pharma and after she and Paul had gotten married, Sheila told Paul that she wanted to start having her brother come by their condo more often so she could spend some time with him. Since her brother still had not been told about Paul, these visits were a major inconvenience because in preparation for them, Paul and Sheila had to make it seem like Paul didn't exist. Sheila would take down all of their wedding pictures and other pictures that had Paul in them, and Paul would have to pack up all of his personal effects and anything else that might be connected to him that was in the condo. And then he would head to the local Marriott hotel where he would stay until the brother's visit was over. But even though this arrangement seemed kind of outrageous to Paul, he wasn't about to try to convince Sheila to change her mind. Sheila was very protective of her brother and got very emotional anytime Paul brought him up. And so the way Paul saw it was the occasional weekend away was a chance for him to get some marathon sessions of work in, and he'd be making his wife happy. On the rare occasions when Paul and Sheila were actually home together with nothing else to do, Sheila's favorite activity was telling Paul all about the office politics at Purdue Pharma. And Paul welcomed the chance to learn a little bit more about his wife's day-to-day life. Most of Sheila's office stories revolved around small issues she was having with staff in her department, or who was applying for what job, or who was on their way up at Purdue, or who was on their way down. But by the summer of 2001, there was a drama unfolding at Purdue Pharma that Sheila found totally fascinating. And before long, Sheila was talking about this big spectacle, not just to Paul, but to her mom and her dad and her in-laws. And if she and Paul went out to dinner or met up with their own friends outside of their work, she talked about it to them too. It turned out there was a new love triangle at Purdue Pharma that involved one of Sheila's friends, a woman named Melissa, along with another woman named Annalisa and a man named Jack. Sheila was only close with Melissa. Her only interactions with Annalisa and Jack were when she would just pass by them at the office or when she would see them at those after-work happy hours at the local bar. But through Melissa, Sheila would learn a lot about Jack and Annalisa. Jack was 35 years old and had a doctorate of pharmacy, and he worked on researching and developing pain medications. He had started at Purdue Pharma back in September of 2000, so about 5 months after Sheila had started working there, and within a few months of his arrival, he had started dating another coworker, Annalisa, who was 32 years old, and he had met her at one of those meetups at that local bar after work. But not too long after Jack started seeing Annalisa, did he meet Sheila's friend, Melissa, also at one of those after-work happy hours. Annalisa didn't know it, but Jack started dating Melissa too. And even though Melissa was pretty sure Jack was also dating Annalisa, Melissa was so into Jack and so sure that eventually Jack would stop dating Annalisa that she just kept going out with Jack. But despite her confidence, the whole love triangle situation was very hard on Melissa, and the one person at the office that she had started talking to about it was Sheila. And as Melissa shared every intimate detail about her relationship with Jack, the secret meetups, the weekend ski trips and camping trips and wild sex, Sheila and Melissa went from just being good office friends to being best friends. At first, Paul was pretty interested in this love triangle that Sheila kept talking about. He also felt flattered when Sheila began seeking his insights about Jack. Why would Jack see two women at the same time? Why does Jack like one more than the other? Did Paul agree with Melissa that eventually Jack would choose Melissa over Annalisa? Paul's advice for Melissa was just to talk with Jack, or talk with Annalisa and let her know that Jack had been cheating on her. But Sheila told Paul that Melissa still held out hope that Jack would come back to her, and if she told Annalisa that Jack had been cheating on her, then Jack would just be angry at Melissa. Paul started to feel like his wife was just pretty much ignoring all of his advice, and Paul was starting to worry that Sheila was maybe getting a little bit too involved in her friend's drama, because pretty soon it seemed to Paul and to Sheila's other friends that this love triangle was literally all Sheila ever wanted to talk about. It had become like a real-life soap opera, a reality TV show that his wife found much more interesting than her weekly episodes of Friends or her romance novels. Now, when Sheila's brother would come to visit them, Paul couldn't wait to pack up his stuff and head for the Marriott Hotel because he was sick and tired of hearing about Jack and his two girlfriends. But this love triangle drama was only just getting started. In the first half of 2002, two things happened that kicked the gossip mill at Purdue Pharma into high gear. In February, Annalisa, who had worked at Purdue Pharma for several years and was a very popular and promising employee, got a job with another pharmaceutical company in New Jersey called Pharmacia. When this happened, Melissa was very hopeful that Jack would finally just break it off with Annalisa because Annalisa would likely have to move 2 hours away to where her new office was located. But shortly after getting this new job at Pharmacia, Annalisa had arranged with her new employer to do most of her work from her condo in Stamford and only drive to New Jersey for important meetings, meaning Annalisa would still be in town and so could still see Jack. And worse than that was that Jack seemed to be getting tired of Melissa. Around the time Annalisa started this new job, Jack told Melissa that he wanted to spend more time with Annalisa, although he did still continue to see Melissa, just not as often. To Melissa, this could mean only one thing. Annalisa must be pressuring Jack to get married and settle down with her. And apparently, that pressure worked because in the summer of 2002, Jack delivered a crushing blow to Sheila's friend Melissa. He told her that he wanted to break off their relationship completely. And Melissa would find out that not long after this breakup, Jack was spending most nights not with his roommates in Stamford, but with Annalisa at her condo that overlooked the Long Island Sound. And now that Annalisa wasn't an employee of Purdue Pharma, she and Jack felt like they could be more open about their deepening relationship. So now Melissa's own coworkers knew that Jack and Annalisa were a couple. And even though Melissa put on a good public show of taking this news in stride, even telling Jack that, oh yeah, what we have was just a fling, Sheila would tell Paul that her friend was actually devastated and humiliated, and that Melissa was having a lot of trouble letting go of her feelings for Jack. Not long after this, Sheila asked Paul if she could have his old pair of night vision binoculars and his eavesdropping equipment. These items were leftovers from Paul's college days when he and his buddies were big fans of The X-Files, the popular 90s science fiction TV show about extraterrestrial life and mysteries that have no rational explanation. When Paul asked Sheila why she needed these things, she told him that Melissa was going to start staking out Annalise's property to see what she and Jack were up to, and that she, Sheila, was going to go with her, and so Paul's equipment would help them spy on them. Paul was a little alarmed, but considering how intense this love triangle drama seemed to be, he wasn't all that surprised, and so, against his better judgment, he told his wife she was welcome to use his things. In addition to spying on Annalise's property, Melissa also began listening to Jack's voicemails. She had somehow got his password, and she had even begun using the information she got in his voicemails to show up at places she knew Jack was going to be. Melissa had even arranged one time to run into Jack at an airport and flew back home in the seat right next to him. Periodically, Melissa would forward some of these voicemails to Sheila, and she would ask her to listen closely to see if the messages offered any clues about how serious Jack and Annalisa were as a couple. And whenever Sheila got these messages forwarded to her, she would always ask Paul to come listen to them as well. And even though Paul would humor his wife and listen and give his insights, privately, he started thinking that this whole love triangle situation was getting really out of control. But this drama was still just getting started. One day, Sheila came home with a set of lockpicks that she had picked up for Melissa. Apparently, Melissa had told Sheila that she wanted to get inside of Annalisa's condo to look at any pictures Annalisa had of her and Jack and see if that gave her a better sense of what their relationship was actually like. Also, Melissa wanted to see how much of Jack's stuff was actually inside of Annalisa's apartment. Sheila asked Paul if he would help her learn how to use these lockpicks so she could then teach Melissa when she handed the picks over. Paul did not think breaking into Annalisa's apartment was a good idea, but he didn't think Melissa would actually use them. Still, Paul was relieved when neither he nor Sheila could use the lockpicks to open even the bathroom door, let alone the much more sophisticated lock on their front door. Especially since Sheila also revealed to him that she had also bought her friend 2 stun guns in case Melissa was caught in Annalisa's apartment and needed to defend herself. With the failure of the lockpicks, Sheila and Melissa turned their attention away from how Melissa could get into Annalisa's apartment to how they could possibly bug Jack's office. That way, Melissa wouldn't just be able to hear Jack's voice messages, she could also hear all of his in-person conversations, as well as his end of any phone calls he was taking in his office. But when Melissa tried to set up Paul's eavesdropping equipment near Jack's office, it didn't work. By the fall of 2002, Jack was showing no signs of wanting to leave Annalisa to go back with Melissa. And while this inspired Melissa to up the ante with her surveillance efforts, Sheila, on the other hand, was becoming less interested in the whole thing. It seemed like it might have dawned on her that what they were doing was just not okay and could definitely get them in a lot of trouble. And so in early November of 2002, Sheila started to distance herself from Melissa and basically stopped talking about the love triangle altogether. Paul was happy to be hearing so much less about Melissa and Jack, but he also realized that without that constant source of conversation, Paul felt like he and Sheila were just kind of drifting apart. He knew his own work also had a lot to do with that. That fall, he was in the middle of running a clinical trial for a new cancer drug. On November 13th, he'd had a meeting in Manhattan with one of the drug manufacturers he was working with, a company called Pharmacia. He remembered the meeting for 2 reasons. The first was during the endless saga about this love triangle at Purdue Pharma, his wife had told him that Annalisa had gotten a job at Pharmacia. The second reason was because during this meeting, the researchers from Pharmacia all seemed very subdued, even though the clinical trial they were talking about actually showed a lot of promise. When Paul asked one of the Pharmacia employees if there was something wrong, the guy said they were all just really shocked at the recent murder of one of their researchers. When Paul got home that evening, he asked Sheila if she'd heard anything about a murder at Pharmacia, because wasn't that the place that Annalisa had gone for her new job? Sheila sat up and said no, she hadn't heard anything about a murder, and as far as she knew, Annalisa was okay. A couple days later, when Paul and Sheila were sitting in silence in their condo, Paul decided to try to strike up a conversation with his wife. And so he asked her, "How's Melissa doing?" Sheila would tell Paul that Jack and Annalisa had actually broken up for good, and that Annalisa had moved to New Jersey, and that now Jack and Melissa were back together and dating each other exclusively. Paul was surprised. He didn't expect Jack and Melissa to ever get back together again, considering how insane Melissa had been. But he figured that if Annalisa had moved to New Jersey, that Jack likely would not have put up with a long-distance relationship, and so maybe that was why things had worked out the way they had. But Paul decided not to ask any more questions, and so he and Sheila just went back to sitting in silence, which was quickly becoming the norm between them. These days, not only was Sheila not talking to Paul, but she was also having her brother come over more often, which of course meant that Paul would have to leave his home more often and stay at the Marriott Hotel. This was becoming totally infuriating for Paul, but he wasn't entirely shocked that as their marriage was clearly beginning to erode, Sheila was turning to her family for comfort and not him. And so Paul told himself that what he really needed to do was just pay more attention to Sheila and try to be a better husband any chance he could. So a few months later, on the late afternoon of Saturday, March 22nd, 2003, when Sheila walked into Paul's home office and told him that she'd heard about this game at work and she really wanted to play it with him, Paul, despite having no clue what this game was, stopped what he was doing and immediately said, "Yes, I'll play." Sheila told him the game was a trust game where each of them would take turns lying on the ground and guessing what objects the other person was pressing against their bodies. To make sure they couldn't cheat, when it was their turn to lie on the floor and guess, they'd have to wear a blindfold, and their hands would also be secured above their head to the rungs of a heavy chair, so they couldn't touch the objects they were supposed to identify. As she described this game, they both quickly came to the realization that this game seemed pretty involved and time-consuming. So it wasn't just something they could do right then and there, because they actually had plans that night to go see Sheila's parents. So they decided they would wait until the next day, Sunday, to play this game. But Sunday morning rolled around and it was still too busy to play. Paul had plans to go into Columbia University that morning, and then when he got back, Sheila said they should really go visit Paul's mom out in White Plains. So they both hopped into the car, and 40 minutes later, they were eating a light lunch, drinking tea, and chatting with Paul's mom about the upcoming Academy Awards that would be broadcast that evening. Then they jumped back into the car, and when they arrived back at their condo, Paul took their two dogs out for a walk, and after he got back, Sheila looked at him with a smile and said, "Are you ready to play the game now?" All in all, it had actually been one of their best weekends together in a long time. Conversations were flowing naturally, and they both just seemed happy and upbeat. Also, Sheila had mentioned to Paul that maybe it was time that she and her parents talk to her brother and bring him in on the big family secret that Sheila was married. So even though Paul would have preferred to just relax that afternoon, in fact, he had forgotten all about the game, he knew it was important to Sheila, so he said, "Sure, let's play." Sheila said, "Okay, I'll get the stuff we need." And when she came back to the kitchen a few minutes later, Sheila was holding a pair of black pantyhose and a pair of handcuffs. For just a second, Paul thought maybe Sheila had in mind taking a page out of her friend Melissa's book and staging a steamy sex scene of her own. But when Sheila saw the look on Paul's face, she laughed and told him, no, it wasn't anything like that. It was really just a trust game. No one was taking any clothes off. So at about 4 p.m. that Sunday afternoon, Paul followed Sheila into the spare bedroom where the floor was padded with carpet and where there was a chair with sturdy wooden rungs attached to the legs of the chair. Sheila went first. She put the pillow down on the floor. Then, dressed in her jeans and t-shirt, she lay down on her back with her head on the pillow, and she stretched her arms out above her head so Paul could handcuff her wrists to the rungs of the heavy chair. Then he wrapped the blindfold around her head and asked her if she could see anything. When she said no, Paul started to gather the random objects he was going to test her with. First, he put one of their little dogs against Sheila's side, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Then he put a camera on her chest. She couldn't figure out that one either. The next one was easy. It was just a box, and Sheila guessed it right away. And then after successfully guessing a few more items, Sheila told Paul it was his turn. Glad the game wasn't actually taking very much time, Paul uncuffed Sheila's wrists, and just a few minutes later, Sheila had secured his hands to the chair rung, wrapped the blindfold around his eyes, and asked if he was ready to play. Paul said he was, and then a few moments later, like Paul, Sheila started with the dog, but Paul guessed immediately that it was the dog. Sheila then pressed an ink printer cartridge against his arm and a shampoo bottle against his chest, but Paul was good at this and he got both of them right. After that, Sheila started walking all over the condo, going into every drawer and cabinet, trying to find the most obscure things she possibly could to try to trip him up, but he just kept getting them right. At one point, Paul heard Sheila getting something from the kitchen, and while Paul was actually starting to kind of enjoy the game because he was so good at it, he started to become aware that Sheila was annoyed that he was so good at it. So when he heard Sheila walk back into the room from being in the kitchen, he wasn't surprised when he heard her say, "Okay, this is the last one." Then he heard a little rustling noise, and suddenly he felt Sheila's weight on top of him, kneeling it felt like, so that one of her legs were on either side of his thighs. Then he felt a smooth, cylindrical object pressed against his cheek, and then he smelled wax. Just as Paul opened his mouth to say, "It's a candle," he suddenly felt a huge blow to his chest. It felt like someone had dropped a giant barbell on top of him. And then he heard Sheila scream. On the early afternoon of November 8th, 2002, 4 months before Sheila and Paul played the trust game, the Stamford Police Department received a 911 call from a payphone located near 123 Harbor Drive, a complex of luxury condos overlooking the nearby Long Island Sound. The unidentified caller told police that they had witnessed an assault at one of the condos. They told police to check Unit 105 before ending the call abruptly and hanging up on the dispatcher. A few minutes later, 2 responding police officers who had been patrolling in an area near this complex of condos parked their patrol cars in the residence parking lot, walked up the outside steps to Unit 105, and knocked on the door. When no one answered, police checked the doorknob and found that the door was unlocked. After opening the door just an inch and yelling through the open door, "Stamford Police, is anyone home?" and hearing no response, one of the officers pushed the door open all the way and took a few cautious steps inside. The sight that met his eyes was so shocking and violent that he immediately pulled out his weapon, and before his partner had even stepped across the threshold behind him, the first officer was already on his radio calling for an ambulance and backup. In the hallway that stretched out right in front of these 2 officers lay the body of a young woman. She was still bleeding from blunt force trauma and stab wounds to her face, neck, chest, and head. Barefoot, but dressed in jeans and a white sweater that was soaked with blood. She was sprawled on her back, her one leg stretched out on the floor, the other with the knee bent and propped up against a box. The walls of the condo were splattered with blood, and pools and drops of blood lined the hallway. The 2 police officers knew, even before the EMTs arrived and confirmed it, that this woman was dead. But she hadn't died quickly, and she hadn't died without putting up an epic fight against whoever had attacked her. Along with scarlet smears of blood everywhere, the floors were also littered with broken glass and dirt and leaves from overturned plants. There was a laundry basket that had been tipped over, spilling clothes everywhere, and most of the furniture was toppled. There were dishes and silverware all over the kitchen floor, and there were books and other papers scattered about. The apartment was a total wreck. From all the family pictures on the walls, and the young woman's computer, and the wallet inside of her handbag, it didn't take police long to identify the victim. With no sign of forced entry, investigators assumed that the victim must have opened the door for her murderer. Based on the autopsy report that showed 9 separate stab wounds, one of them so deep the tip of the knife penetrated through the woman's chest to the very back of her lung, investigators concluded that one of the motives for this attack must have been pure rage. There was no sign of sexual assault. Police didn't have to look very hard to find their first person of interest. By that evening, the victim's boyfriend, whose clothes and other personal effects were found inside the apartment, had pulled up outside his girlfriend's condo. Once there, he rolled down his car window and asked one of the dozens of law enforcement personnel who'd set up a perimeter outside of the crime scene what was going on. The police asked him to identify himself. He said his name was Nelson Sessler and that he was a research scientist at Purdue Pharmaceuticals in downtown Stamford. He said he had met the victim back in 2000 when they both worked for Purdue Pharma. They had started dating in December of 2000, and then starting in the early fall of 2002, just a few months earlier, he had basically moved into her condo, despite still renting a place of his own. Tall, thin but strong, and handsome, Nelson immediately became investigators' #1 suspect. But cameras at Purdue Pharma along with a digital log that registers every time employees enter or exit the building, backed up Nelson's claim that he'd been at work the entire day and so could not have been the murderer. Despite the rock-solid alibi, police did not think Nelson was being completely forthcoming with them. In particular, when they asked him if he was having any issues with his girlfriend or if there was anyone he knew of that might want to harm his girlfriend, he just kind of dismissed the questions instead of trying to help them understand what might have happened. The other two promising leads police initially had also led to dead ends. They had tracked that 911 call that had led to the crime scene to a payphone outside of a restaurant about a half-mile away from the victim's condo, but they had not had any luck finding the person who had made that call. And despite calling in the Connecticut State Major Crimes Unit to help process the crime scene, investigators had failed to come up with any fingerprints or trace DNA that might lead them to the killer. It wasn't until 4 months later, when Sheila played the trust game with her husband Paul, that police would finally get the break they were looking for in this murder case. On the evening of March 23rd, the same day that Paul and Sheila had been playing the trust game, Paul woke up in the post-surgery unit of Westchester Medical Center in Pleasantville, New York. He had arrived at the hospital late in the afternoon in critical condition, and the doctors who had operated on him felt like it was a miracle he had survived. After the effects of general anesthesia had worn off and Paul's vital signs were stable, he was moved to a private room to recover. As Paul became fully aware of his surroundings and began to remember the events of the day, he understood even better than his doctors just how lucky he was to be alive. So when an officer from the Westchester Police arrived in Paul's recovery room at 6:23 p.m. that night and asked Paul what happened, Paul was ready to talk. The story he would tell would be so outrageous and so unbelievable that the law enforcement, hospital staff, and the public would be talking about it for years to come. The following reconstruction is based on the information revealed to police in Paul's statement about what really happened to him during the game he was playing with Sheila. After Paul felt that heavy blow to his chest, Sheila began to scream, but her scream stopped abruptly. At the same time, the pressure Paul was feeling on his chest had left him so winded that he no longer even noticed what Sheila was or wasn't doing. He was just trying to figure out what happened to him. And as he lay there, still handcuffed and blindfolded, he felt another blow to his chest, this one even more powerful than the last one. Then he heard Sheila say, "Oh my gosh, I think I hurt you, you're bleeding." Paul could feel himself starting to sweat, and he asked his wife, "Sheila, what happened? What just happened to me?" Sheila sounded very panicked when she said, "It was an accident, I think the candle must have hurt you." Paul could tell that his wife was not handling this well, and that he needed to try to take charge of whatever was going on. And so he told Sheila not to panic, and then he told her to take the blindfold off of him. When she didn't respond right away, he said very clearly and loudly, "Sheila, take the blindfold off." This time, she did as he asked, and when Paul could see again, he could see Sheila was standing over him, looking around the room wildly, like she was totally nervous, and before he could even ask, she said she couldn't find the keys to the handcuffs. Paul looked from his wife down across his chest, which he did not have a very good view of because he's still on his back, to see if maybe there was some sign as to what caused the pressure and subsequent pain he was feeling there. But there was nothing visible on his chest and there was no blood or anything. Still, he knew something big must have just happened to him because his whole body was starting to react like he'd experienced major trauma. The pain he felt was starting to localize around a particular spot in the center of his chest, and he could feel his heart starting to race. Without the handcuff keys, Paul needed to break the rung of the chair that he was handcuffed to. So he looked back up at his wife, who was still just standing there looking all around the room, and he said to her as calmly as he could, "Sheila, come over here and break the chair." Sheila looked at Paul and her eyes were super wide, and she very slowly walked over to where he was, and then she knelt down beside him, and then it seemed like it took forever, but she did finally break the chair rung, and so with his hands still handcuffed, but now able to be moved around, Paul attempted to stand up, but the pain in his chest was now so severe he couldn't, so he just kind of rolled over onto his side. Paul told Sheila she'd done a great job breaking the chair, but now she needed to call 911. Sheila looked like she understood the assignment, but when she left the room, instead of calling 911, She just went into the kitchen and poured a cup of juice, and then she walked back into the room where Paul was, and she bent down over Paul and handed him the drink and told him, just drink this and you'll feel better. Even though Paul didn't know what happened to him, he knew a cup of juice was not going to help. So, trying not to get angry with his wife, he said, Sheila, I'm really hurt here. Put the juice down and call 911. I need an ambulance. Sheila, who had a look of total shock on her face, slowly stood back up and put the juice on the desk. Then she seemed to struggle to find her cell phone before pulling it out of the back pocket of her jeans. Once she got her phone out, she put it to her ear, and then she began to run back and forth from the spare bedroom they were in, into the hallway, into the kitchen, and then back to look at Paul. And while she's doing this, Paul could only hear little bits of the conversation she was having on the phone, but he heard Sheila give the dispatcher their address and say that it was her husband and that he was bleeding and they needed an ambulance. When she got off the phone, she came back into the room, and Paul asked her to help him stand up. He needed to get to a mirror so he could look at his chest and see what happened. Sheila helped pull Paul to his feet, and he stumbled into the bathroom, but what he saw just didn't explain the amount of pain he was now feeling. It looked like there were just 2 small marks on his chest, almost like scratch marks. He thought to himself, maybe Sheila had had some kind of seizure and had fallen on him, and that maybe the candle she was holding had some sort of metal component on it, and so when she fell onto him, maybe that metal piece on the candle had punctured his chest. Now, he knew this was a ridiculous theory, but he just couldn't understand what was going on. As he was standing there, Paul could feel himself start to fade, and he told Sheila to help him lie back down on the floor. And then all he could think about was the ambulance. Where was it? How much time had passed? After he was back on the ground, Paul told Sheila to call 911 again, and when he heard her start to talk, he told her to bring the phone over and hold it down next to his ear because he wanted to speak to the operator himself. But Sheila turned away from him and said no, the operator did not want to talk to him, that he just needed to lie still and wait for help. Starting to panic, Paul asked his wife, when was the ambulance going to get here? What did they tell you? Sheila made a shushing motion at him, then told him that they were apparently short-staffed and they wouldn't be able to get there for at least another 25 or 30 minutes. Paul could not believe what he was hearing. He told Sheila that was absolutely absurd that he would have to wait that long for an emergency. But Sheila would tell him that the operator she was speaking to thought Paul's sense of time was probably just off because he was hurt, and that was actually a totally reasonable amount of time to wait. And then Sheila just left the room. Paul figured she must be leaving to make another call to 911, or maybe she was going to get help from a neighbor. Meanwhile, desperate to have the use of his hands again, Paul managed to break one of the flimsy handcuff locks. The handcuffs were still dangling from one wrist, but at least he could now use his hands. With a huge effort, Paul was able to pull himself up to his knees, clutching onto the futon for support while gasping at the pain he was now feeling in his chest. Suddenly, he heard Sheila's voice again. She was standing in front of him, holding a little medicine cup that was full of liquid cold medicine. "Here, Paul," she told him. "This is NyQuil. This'll make you feel better." Paul didn't even answer her. Instead, he just pushed the NyQuil aside, then stood all the way up and staggered out to the living room couch. Sheila followed and sat beside him, waiting patiently, while Paul could literally feel the life draining out of him. Suddenly, Paul made a decision. He had to act now. So he turns to Sheila and he says, "Let's go." She could just drive him to Westchester Medical Center. On a Sunday afternoon, it would only take them about 10 minutes to get there. "Okay," Sheila said, "but let's get your jacket on first." Once Paul had struggled to get into his jacket, Sheila left to go bring the car around to the front of the condo. Everything Sheila did seemed to take forever, and when Sheila did finally get Paul settled into the back seat of the car, instead of taking the direct route to the hospital, she took the scenic route, driving slowly along winding secondary roads. And they hadn't even gone that far when Sheila stopped the car on the side of the road, hopped out, and then opened the door to the back seat and told Paul she thought he should lie down rather than sit up. He looked at her incredulously and just said, "No, get back in the car, just drive, Sheila." And when finally they did pull into the hospital complex, instead of following the clearly marked signs to the emergency room entrance, Sheila drove slowly behind the hospital to a mostly empty parking lot alongside the behavioral health building. Once there, she drove to the farthest end of the lot up on a hill before finally bringing the car to a stop. When Sheila turned off the engine, Paul heard the sound of her car keys getting dropped onto the floor in front of the driver's seat. As Paul started to struggle to sit up so he could get out, he heard the sound of Sheila fumbling around on the floor of the car looking for her keys. When she had finally found them, she opened her door and stepped out into the lot and made her way around to his side. But when she opened his door, instead of helping him get out, she lunged at him. Clutched in her hand was a knife, the same knife that she had used earlier that afternoon when she had stabbed him twice in the chest while he was lying on the ground, blindfolded and handcuffed to a chair. Before Paul could even register what was happening, Sheila was on top of him, raising the knife over her head, and then just a second later, she had plunged it, now for a third time, into his chest. As Sheila started to raise her hand again for another blow, Paul's adrenaline kicked into hyperdrive. As she brought the knife down again, Paul managed to block her blow, and then he pushed her off of him and he stumbled out into the parking lot. Then he turned, and as Sheila charged at him, he reached out and grabbed the blade of her knife with his bare hands and yanked it away from her. Even though his attacker was now disarmed, Paul was critically injured. Sheila's third stab wound had nicked an artery, and blood was now starting to fill his lungs and chest cavity. But as he grappled with Sheila, two people stepped out of the behavioral health building, which was about 500 feet away. Paul, using every ounce of strength that he had, turned and started staggering toward these people, calling out for help. All the while, Sheila was hanging on to him, pulling on his clothes, telling him they really needed to talk and that he had to tell people this was all an accident, otherwise she'd get in trouble. The two people who came out of the behavioral health building could clearly see that there was some kind of a fight going on between this man and this woman, and so they started to run toward them. One of the bystanders was a medical resident, and as soon as he saw Paul's blood-soaked clothes, he told the other bystander to call an ambulance. Even though they were already within the hospital complex, the resident realized that Paul likely would never make it to the ER if he went on foot. No one was listening to Sheila's screams that it was her that was being attacked, and when she changed her story and told the resident to please just leave Paul to her and that she'd get him to the ER, Paul used his last ounce of energy to whisper, "No, get away from me," before he crumpled on the ground. As the resident started to work on Paul right there in the parking lot, Sheila, hearing the wail of the approaching ambulance and police cars, turned and started to run. But just a few minutes later, the police had caught up to her and put her in the back of a police cruiser. A little later that night, at the same time the police officer walked into Paul's recovery room and asked him what happened, a detective was already questioning Sheila, and more law enforcement personnel were out in the parking lot examining the area where Sheila and Paul had been seen fighting. It was out there in the parking lot that the police would find Sheila's cell phone. During her struggle with Paul, she had dropped it before trying to take off and evade capture. Back on the morning of November 8th, 2002, 4 months before Sheila would try to kill her husband, Sheila got up at her usual time, she dressed for work, and arrived at Purdue Pharma at 8:09 a.m. At 10:53 a.m., she left Purdue Pharma, swiping her security badge at the building's front entrance. Then she walked to her car, hopped into the driver's seat, and made the 10-minute drive out to 123 Harbor Drive. It was a beautiful day, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, clear and cool. The light breeze made little waves in the water where many residents of the luxury condo complex moored their boats. After parking her car and checking her pockets, Sheila also glanced in the rearview mirror to make sure no loose strands of her hair had come out of the tight bun at the nape of her neck. Then she made her way up the flight of outside steps that would lead her to the front door of apartment 105. Once she was standing outside of it, she knocked on the door. As soon as she heard footsteps inside of the apartment walking toward the door, Sheila slipped on the pair of gloves she had in her pockets and wrapped her fingers around the handle of the knife with the 5-inch long blade she also had in her pocket. Then Sheila leaned closer to the door and called out in her friendliest voice, "Hi, Annalisa, is that you? Hey, it's me, Sheila Davalu from Purdue Pharma. Any chance you have a minute? I really need to talk to you." From behind the closed door, Annalisa recognized the voice of her former coworker. "Sheila, wow, haven't seen you in a while. Yeah, just a minute, let me open the door." About an hour later, Sheila was back in her car. She was still flooded with adrenaline and excitement. In the course of killing Annalisa, The two women had raged back and forth through every room in the downstairs of the condo until finally Sheila had stabbed Annalisa so hard that she could feel the thin knife blade sink right up to the hilt, buried in Annalisa's chest. Afterwards, Sheila made no attempt to clean anything up. Instead, she carefully walked into Annalisa's bathroom, and then once she was in there, Sheila spent a minute or two trying to catch her breath, leaning against the scalloped edges of the sink, and looking into the mirror to make sure she'd gotten all of the blood spatter off of her face before going back to the kitchen and picking her coat up off the table. Then she wrapped the coat around herself to keep people from seeing all of Annalisa's blood all over her clothes, and then she walked out the door, got back into her car, and headed for a payphone outside of a nearby restaurant. Once she arrived at the payphone, Sheila called 911. It was only as she was pressing the payphone buttons that she noticed a cut on her right hand that she must have gotten when she was struggling with Annalisa. But right then, the dispatcher picked up the call, and Sheila immediately focused her attention on delivering the script she had so carefully planned. She took a quick breath, and then, without giving her name and while sounding totally upset and panic-stricken, Sheila told the operator in a breathless voice that she had just seen her neighbor being assaulted. As soon as Sheila had given the dispatcher Annalisa's address, she quickly ended the call, got back into her car, and headed for her own condo in Pleasantville, New York. At 1:53 p.m. that afternoon, Sheila returned to work at Purdue Pharma. When she went home that night, she spent a quiet evening with Paul. When a coworker called her late that night to say that their former colleague, Annalisa, had been murdered, Sheila acted completely shocked, but she didn't say anything about it to Paul, because all Sheila was really thinking about now was Nelson Sessler, the man whose girlfriend she had just killed. It would turn out all the crazy stories Sheila had told Paul and her friends and her family about what Melissa was up to, from the crazy sex with the man she was obsessed with, Jack, to the insane surveillance operation this woman carried out on Jack and Annalisa, well, those stories all really happened. They were true. But Melissa was not the woman at the center of them. It was Sheila. Sheila was Melissa and always had been. And Jack, the man she was obsessed with, that man was actually Nelson Sessler. The only real name in the Purdue Pharma love triangle was Nelson Sessler's girlfriend, Annalisa Raimundo, who Sheila killed just so she could have Nelson all to herself. Sheila did have a mentally ill brother, but it wasn't because of him that Sheila made Paul leave with all of his belongings every time he came to town. It was so Sheila could entertain her lover, Nelson, right inside of Paul and Sheila's home. Nelson would later say he truly had no idea Sheila was married. And all those after-work trips to the local bar with coworkers and Sheila's supposed volleyball league she was in, those were just excuses to see Nelson as well. After killing Annalisa, Sheila rushed to be by Nelson's side, and she supported him while he grieved the loss of his girlfriend. And while she did that, Sheila was able to convince Nelson to restart their own relationship. And once that happened, Sheila felt like her mission was complete. She had her man back. And so that was around the time that she stopped talking about Melissa and the love triangle to Paul, which Paul misinterpreted as Sheila distancing herself from Melissa. That was also around the time that Sheila decided she would just have to kill Paul as well, because he was also getting in the way of her romance with Nelson. So she came up with this trust game because it would give her a way to immobilize Paul so she could easily stab him. Even though police had a solid case against Sheila for the attempted murder of her husband, it wasn't until they looked at her cell phone that she had dropped in the parking lot that the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. It would turn out, after stabbing her husband, Paul, during the trust game, Sheila never actually made any calls to 911. Instead, as she raced around the apartment, pretending to be on the phone, and also offering Paul first a glass of juice and then also NyQuil as he lay on the ground dying, the only person Sheila was actually trying to get a hold of was Nelson Sessler. Now that Paul was going to die any minute, she wanted to talk with Nelson and invite him over for dinner at her condo that night. When Sheila couldn't get a hold of Nelson on the phone, she left him several voice messages asking him to come over and join her because she had some fun things planned for both of them. When police examined Sheila's phone, they immediately recognized Nelson Sessler's phone number and discovered what it was that Nelson Sessler had not been forthright about when they interviewed him following his girlfriend Annalisa's death. What Nelson neglected to mention was that he had been seeing another woman, Sheila, at the same time he was dating Annalisa, and he just didn't want anyone to know. It would take police almost 4 years to build a concrete case against Sheila for the first-degree murder of Annalisa Raimundo, and another 4 years before the case actually went to trial. But they got the break they needed when they re-examined all the forensic evidence from Annalisa's apartment. On one of the faucet handles of that bathroom sink with the scalloped edges where Sheila had stood and cleaned herself up after stabbing Annalisa to death, forensic experts found a single tiny drop of blood that must have fallen from that cut on Sheila's right hand. That drop contained the combined DNA of Annalisa and her killer, Sheila Davalloo. On February 19, 2004, Sheila was sentenced to 25 years in prison in New York for the attempted murder of her husband, Paul Christos, and on April 26, 2012, Sheila was sentenced to 50 years in prison in Connecticut for the murder of Annalisa Raimundo. The two sentences are going to be served one after the other. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please tell the 5-star review button that you'd love to go to their dance recital, but show up to it in disguise so they don't recognize you and they have to spend their whole performance searching the crowd in vain for you. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. We've all heard about scorned ex-lovers lashing out at their former partners when the relationship comes to an end, but it's unlikely you've ever heard of what happens between the lovers in today's story. It is quite possibly the most unlikely outcome of a failed relationship ever. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please convince the 5-star review button to get a very large, intricate tattoo that they were on the fence about getting. And then once they follow through and get it, shrug your shoulders and tell them, I don't like it very much. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Michelle Hadley was born in 1985 in Ontario, California, a city located 40 miles east of Los Angeles. Her parents, who owned a small manufacturing business in town, never had a ton of money, but they always had enough to make ends meet. Growing up, Michelle's parents taught her and her younger sister to always put their all into whatever it was they were involved in, whether it was academics, athletics, or relationships. They also taught their daughters to always take their Christianity very seriously. By the time Michelle was in high school, she had made her parents very proud, becoming one of the top students in her class, and also becoming a very talented cross-country runner. But despite these early successes, Michelle never bragged about them. Not because she was trying to stay humble necessarily, but because that was just her personality. She was a very private person who did not seek the spotlight. After high school, Michelle attended Dickinson College in Pennsylvania on a scholarship, and then after graduation, when Michelle was just 22 years old, she married her high school sweetheart. However, that relationship would not last. When they divorced just 4 years later, Michelle was upset about it, but she was confident that she was going to be okay. She was still very young, she had the full support of her family, and she had a good job that allowed her to be self-sufficient. All she needed to do was to be patient and wait for the right partner to come along. And in 2013, roughly a year after her divorce, it seemed like the right partner had. In August of that year, Michelle connected with a U.S. Marshal named Ian Diaz on a dating website. The U.S. Marshal Service is the federal government's primary agency for fugitive investigations. Shortly after Michelle and Ian connected online, they met in person for the first time over a cup of coffee. At 35, Ian was 9 years older than Michelle. He was tall and fit. Michelle was slender with dark hair and deep brown eyes. They both had great smiles, and right away they hit it off. That first cup of coffee was quickly followed by text messages, phone calls, and arrangements to meet again. On just their second date, Ian blurted out, "I love you," to Michelle. This definitely caught Michelle by surprise, but she was thrilled. As a child, she sometimes fantasized about being a princess and having her Prince Charming come along and whisk her away. And suddenly it seemed like that actually was happening. Over the next several months, the pair would continue to see each other on a near-daily basis, and then in the spring of 2014, they moved in together, and then in December of 2014, Ian took Michelle on a trip to New York City where he asked for her hand in marriage, and she would say yes. Michelle was on cloud nine. Ian really was her Prince Charming. Once they were engaged, Michelle threw herself into planning their perfect future together as Mr. and Mrs. Diaz. However, cracks began to appear in their relationship. Michelle would later say that Ian had pressured her to take a $20,000 pay cut to leave her job that she loved and take a marketing position at a place he loved and had once worked himself, Disneyland Resort in Anaheim, California. She also said that Ian began asking her to wear more revealing, sexier clothes, and he wanted her to get acrylic nails and get her belly button pierced. It wasn't Michelle's style, but since she didn't want to disappoint her future husband, she would, from time to time, put on the crop tops and short skirts just to make him happy. But despite doing that, Ian never really did seem happy, and eventually he would open up to her about some of his deeper sexual fantasies. He told Michelle that what he really wanted to see was her having sex with other men. At first, Michelle was stunned and said, "No, absolutely not." But despite her refusal, Ian brought the subject up again and again, each time with a little more insistence, and then finally, Michelle agreed. On Valentine's Day 2015, with enough cold medicine and alcohol in her system to lower her inhibitions, Michelle had sex with a stranger that she believed Ian had recruited on Craigslist. What Michelle didn't know was that Ian had filmed the entire sexual encounter, and then afterward, he wanted to watch it with her. Michelle was horrified. She begged Ian to destroy this video, but Ian refused and said, "No one forced you to do it." But despite these huge issues in their relationship, they did not cause the couple to end their engagement. In fact, these issues only seemed to bring the couple closer together, if for the wrong reasons. As Ian became more and more controlling of Michelle, Michelle became more and more emotionally dependent on Ian. And so with that in mind, in June of 2015, 8 months before their wedding date, Ian and Michelle took out a mortgage together and they moved into a brand new 2-story condo in downtown Anaheim, California. It was Michelle who came up with the entire $14,400 down payment, but she didn't care. She and Ian were both so excited about a change of scenery to hopefully get their relationship back on track. Just weeks after moving in, all of the excitement of the new place was gone, and in its place were all of their old unresolved issues. Soon, minor disagreements became major arguments, and major arguments turned into vicious accusations of infidelity and betrayal. Finally, the fights turned physical. When Michelle threatened to leave, he held her down on the bed while she tried to kick and claw her way free. Families on both sides of the warring couple had the same advice. You are not good for each other, you need to end it. So at the end of August, just 2 months after Ian and Michelle had purchased the condo together, Ian took back the engagement ring he had given Michelle, and Michelle packed up her Volkswagen Jetta and drove off to stay with her parents. But as much as Michelle and Ian now wanted out of their relationship, as long as they owned that condo together, they could not entirely sever ties. Michelle wanted Ian to sell the condo so she could get reimbursed for the down payment she had made, but Ian liked the condo and had no intention of moving out. This put them at a sort of standstill and kind of forced them to continue interacting despite being broken up. And surprisingly, through their somewhat regular exchanges over this property, they learned how to be cordial again. Ian would text Michelle first about the property, and then he would follow up and ask how she was doing, and Michelle would do the same thing to Ian. Even though this did not get them anywhere closer to solving their condo issue, it seemed like they were at least at a point where they could treat each other with respect. However, this would not last. On September 10th, so 1 month after Michelle had moved out and when the condo issue was still completely unresolved, Ian received a very strange and upsetting message from Michelle. In between friendly, cordial text messages, Michelle sent him a long, bizarre, rambly email that could only be described as biblical in her condemnation of the man she once wanted to marry. She wrote, "Your sins are many, including defiling me and my family with your wicked and evil sexual acts, your financial coercion and irresponsibility, your gluttony, your greed, your lust, your sloth, your wrath, your envy, and most of all, your pride." She finished it with, "You may try to hide behind the law of man, but it is a weak shield that will bend and crack against the sword of God. I will bring the full force of the law and the word of God against you to judge you." Ian knew that Michelle and her family were religious, and he knew from their relationship that Michelle was prone to emotional outbursts. But even by her standards, this email revealed a vengefulness that he had not seen before. Ian was so shaken up by it that the very next day, on September 11th, Ian filed a restraining order against Michelle. After reading the email and speaking with Ian, the judge did not grant the restraining order against Michelle. However, Ian's request had now brought Michelle to the notice of the Anaheim police. Shocked that she had even been the subject for a restraining order, Michelle immediately hired an attorney to handle all interactions with Ian, and Ian would hire an attorney as well. And by November of 2015, the lawyers were finally able to work out a compromise with the condo that would allow Michelle and Ian to finally move on from each other. The deal stated that Michelle would not get back her $14,400 down payment. Instead, she would continue to pay half the mortgage for 6 months. But after that, Ian would either assume full responsibility for the mortgage, or he would have to agree to sell the condo and split the profits with Michelle. Even though neither side was fully happy with this arrangement, they both were just exhausted from all the fighting and were ready to just accept it and move on. And so they both signed the agreement, and then the 6-month timer began. Ian stayed in the condo, and Michelle, who was living with her parents, decided to get her own small apartment and go back to school to get her master's in business. In January 2016, just a month or so after the condo settlement was finalized, Ian Diaz met another young woman through a dating site. Her name was Angela Connell. She was roughly the same age as Michelle, and she was looking for a serious relationship. When she and Ian finally met in person, they both liked what they saw. During their first date, Ian was honest with Angela and told her that he had just recently gotten out of an engagement that had ended very badly, but he was still certain he wanted to get married and raise a family, which was very reassuring to Angela. Only 1 month later, Ian and Angela would get married, and Angela would move into Ian's condo, the same condo he had bought with Michelle. In May, just 4 months after meeting Ian and 2 months away from the deadline for Ian to assume paying the full mortgage on the condo or sell the property, Angela surprised her husband with a sonogram and announced that she was pregnant with twins. The couple was beyond excited. They sent copies of the sonogram of the twins to family and friends, and Angela wasted no time prepping their home for the twins' arrival. Everything had moved quickly, but the couple was very excited at the prospect of starting a family together. Later that month, on May 22nd, Angela was at the condo alone when she hopped on her computer to check her email. Once her inbox loaded, she noticed there was an email from a man named Jason Ray. She didn't recognize the name, but at first glance, it looked like a real email from a real person, not some spam message. So she clicked on it to see what it was. And the words she read sent a chill through her body. The email was definitely not spam. It was a personal message intended for Angela. And whoever this Jason person was clearly knew personal details about her and her husband. The email, which was littered with biblical references, explained to Angela that Ian had been unfaithful to her and that he didn't love her and he never would. Jason also told her that Ian was going to harm her if she didn't leave him immediately. And the email closed by telling Angela that she and her husband had sinned against God. Angela stared at her computer screen for quite a while, wondering what she should do. Eventually, after reading it a few more times, she decided it had to be some sort of sick joke and that the best thing to do was just to ignore it. So she deleted the email, shut her computer, and she walked away. The next morning, Angela logged back onto her computer, and when she opened her email, there was a new email from Jason Ray sitting at the top of her inbox. Angela thought about not even opening it and just deleting it. But her curiosity got the better of her and she clicked it open. Once again, the message was aimed at trying to convince Angela to leave Ian. It was full of biblical references, and at certain points it didn't even make any sense. But there was a new twist to this email versus the one she had received the day before. In this email, the sender, Jason, clearly references Michelle, Ian's ex. Jason would write that Angela was Ian's Eve, and Michelle was Ian's Lilith. According to a particular interpretation of Jewish folklore, Lilith was the first wife of Adam from the famous Adam and Eve story. But Lilith was banished from the Garden of Eden for disobeying Adam, at which point God made Eve out of Adam's rib, and then Eve became Adam's wife. While somewhat confusing, the message Jason was sending Angela was fairly clear. Angela was not meant to be Ian's wife. Ian's true wife was Michelle. Angela didn't know anything about Ian's ex, Michelle. All she really knew was her name and that she existed. But despite the lack of insight into who Michelle was, Angela couldn't help but think, this email sounds an awful lot like something a deeply scorned lover would send. And so that night when Ian got home, Angela showed him the latest email from Jason Ray and told him, I think this is your ex, Michelle. At first, Ian was confused. He and Michelle had settled their issues. They had moved on, so why would she write this? But after reading the email a few more times and seeing all the over-the-top biblical language that Michelle had previously used in emails to him, he became convinced as well that this probably was Michelle. However, he told Angela that Michelle was very mercurial and that she must have just gotten worked up about something and she's overreacted. That's why she sent these emails, and she's likely to calm back down and they will never hear from her again. However, he told Angela if the emails do continue, please let him know and he would go to the police. For the next several days, Angela checked her email, but no strange emails came through. But roughly a week after that first Jason Ray email arrived, Angela received another email from Jason Ray, and this time the subject line simply said, die. The body of the message read, I hope you are scared of death tomorrow. Be prepared, don't sleep. Be watchful of the daughters of God. We will steal your child and we will watch as it dies. Within minutes of receiving this email, Angela received a barrage of others from Jason Ray, as well as from other account names she didn't recognize, like Lilith Truth. And all of these messages included the threat that Angela was going to be harmed in the coming days, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Angela was horrified and was starting to wonder if this really was something Michelle could be doing. It just felt so evil. Then she noticed at the bottom of one of the emails she had just received that it literally said, from Michelle. It looked like the signature had been automatically entered into the email template, and then Michelle must have just forgotten to delete it before sending. Or, as Angela and Ian stared at it and discussed what it could mean, they thought, well, maybe she left it in on purpose. Maybe she wants us to know this is from her. Either way, at that point, Ian and Angela felt fairly certain that Michelle was really behind this, and so they printed out all of the nasty emails Angela had received to date, and they took that along with the email Michelle had sent Ian the year before that was very biblical in nature, and they took all of that to the courthouse, and Ian would file another restraining order against Michelle. A few days later, on June 6th, 2 police officers went to Michelle's residence and literally handed her the order to appear in court for this restraining order. The date was set for June 17th. But that night, and over the course of the next several days leading up to this court appearance, Angela continued to receive dozens of emails from Jason Ray and Lilith Truth and other anonymous accounts threatening to make her pay for having filed this restraining order. Even though Ian told Angela that there was just no way Michelle was actually going to hurt her, Angela couldn't help but feel terrified and was afraid to leave the house. Finally, June 17th arrived, and Angela and Ian arrived at the court alongside a huge group of friends and family members who were there to support them. When Michelle walked in with her lawyer, she was met with boos and hisses from all of these supporters, and then once court was called to session, Angela and Ian outlined what had been happening over the last couple of weeks, and they showed the judge the stack of all these emails. The judge reviewed the documents and then turned to Michelle and asked her what she had to say for herself. And she would say, I didn't send those emails. I don't know what's going on. I didn't do this. But the judge wasn't buying it, especially given the fact that Ian had previously filed for a restraining order against Michelle for threatening emails. And so this time, the judge did grant the restraining order, prohibiting Michelle from having any further contact with Ian or Angela. Angela and Ian were thrilled, and when they walked out of the courtroom, they felt confident that this nightmare was finally behind them. But within hours of getting home, Angela started receiving more emails, and immediately they contacted the Anaheim police to report that Michelle was already violating her restraining order. But since the emails they were receiving now were not signed by Michelle, there was no way for the police to prove that Michelle was in fact violating her restraining order. And so for several days, the ferocious, threatening, biblical emails continued, and there was seemingly nothing Ian or Angela could do to stop it. Then, as if it wasn't stressful enough, Angela received an email from an account she had not seen before, inquiring about her rape fantasy request on Craigslist. Angela did not understand what this person was talking about, but eventually, when she went online and investigated, she discovered there was an entire marketplace of people posting ads on Craigslist seeking partners to take part in a rape fantasy. And someone had clearly been pretending to be Angela and was going into these places on Craigslist and responding to all of these ads saying that she, Angela, was interested. And then she would leave them her address and what she looked like and what her daily habits were like. And according to some of these men that were reaching out now to Angela, apparently whoever was doing this was indicating that Angela didn't just want to be a part of some basic rape fantasy. She wanted to be attacked out in public, and she was encouraging these men to follow her and stalk her and then attack her and rape her. And even if she tried to say stop, don't. Angela knew Michelle had to be behind this, but again, there was just no evidence tying these rape fantasy responses to Michelle because she wasn't signing her name to them. And so despite how absolutely horrifying it was to learn this was going on, there was nothing the police could do to stop it. For Angela, this was a nightmare. The stress and the fear of this situation was just so much that she basically just hid in her condo all day long. But on June 24th, so 1 week after the court appearance and just a couple of days after first learning about this rape fantasy ad, Angela had to leave the condo to go out and run a few errands. And so she gathered up her things and she called Ian, who was at work, to let him know that she was heading out in case anything happened to her. And then she left her condo. She went downstairs to the large parking garage underneath their development where residents could park their cars. She hopped in her car and she drove up the ramp out onto the street and then went about her day, running her different errands, and it was totally uneventful. At some point when she was done, she made her way back to the condo complex. She went down the ramp into the underground parking garage. She found her way back to her assigned parking spot. She parked. She got out of her vehicle. She shut the door and she began walking from her car to the door on the far side of the garage that would lead to the stairwell back up to her actual condo. But when she got maybe 30 feet away from this door, she heard movement coming from behind her. She turned around and she saw there was this man who she didn't recognize who was walking very quickly toward her. And because she was already completely on edge, given all these threats she's been receiving, threats of bodily harm, threats of rape, she immediately screamed and started running towards this door that would take her to the stairwell. But before she could open the door and get inside, this man had lunged and grabbed her around the neck, and he was trying to pull her to the ground, and he was trying to pull her clothes off. And Angela began punching and kicking and screaming and biting, doing anything she could. And eventually she was able to fight this person off of her, and he quickly turned and ran away. And then Angela quickly picked up her stuff. She ran into the door, ran upstairs, got into her condo, and as soon as her door had shut and locked behind her, she picked up her phone and she dialed 911. And she was so hysterical that when she talked to the dispatcher, they couldn't understand what was happening, but eventually she was able to tell them what had happened and to please come out here and help her. And then a little while later, when the police showed up, they found Angela still totally hysterical in her condo. Her shirt had been ripped in half and she had red spots all around her neck from where this guy had grabbed her. But overall, she was okay. The police would search the building, but there was no sign of her attacker. However, Angela would tell police that she was fairly confident she understood what had just happened. She explained what was going on with her and her husband's ex, Michelle, and how despite this restraining order against her, she was clearly signing Angela up for these rape fantasies on Craigslist. And so most likely this man who had attacked Angela down in the garage was only there because of this rape fantasy ad. The police took down her statement, and then that night they would go to Michelle's residence and they would show her a search warrant that authorized them to search all of her devices, her phone, her laptop, all of them. And when Michelle turned them over and gave up all of her passwords, the police were able to find enough evidence that she was behind the harassment of Angela and Ian that they arrested her on the spot. Angela and Ian were relieved when they heard the news, and that night, while Michelle was in jail, the threatening emails completely stopped. However, the following day, Michelle posted bail, and within hours of her being free again, Jason Ray and Lilith Truth began bombarding Angela's inbox again. Angela was so distraught, she went to the doctor for a checkup, worried that her stress would negatively affect her pregnancy. And to her horror, the doctor would tell her that she had actually lost the twins. She had miscarried. And if that wasn't horrible enough, the doctor also discovered that her cervical cancer, which had been in remission, was now back. While Angela and Ian grieved the loss of their unborn children and wondered what they would do about Angela's cancer, the horrible emails continued. And men kept showing up at their front door, asking to come inside for violent sex with Angela. Finally, on July 13th, so roughly 2 weeks since Angela was attacked in the parking garage, Angela looked out of her window and she saw there was this young man kind of lurking on the side of their condo complex, and he appeared to be hiding. Worried this guy was going to ambush her as soon as she walked outside, she called the police. The police showed up and they spoke to the young man, who would confirm he was there because he was responding to a rape fantasy ad. He said the woman inside, Angela, had told him to come here and have his way with her. After this incident, Ian was completely fed up and he demanded the police do something about this. You need to go arrest Michelle and keep her behind bars. And sure enough, the next day, Michelle was arrested again. But this time, her bail was set for $1 million, making it impossible for her to make bond. Angela and Ian finally were able to breathe a sigh of relief, although they didn't know exactly what she would be charged with or what the legal outcomes would be. For the time being, so long as Michelle was in jail, they knew they were safe. Except Michelle was completely innocent. Yes, she did send that first fire and brimstone biblical email the year before in September, the one that led to Ian filing that first restraining order request that was denied. But after that, she had lawyered up and not had any contact with Ian or his new wife. In fact, the first time Michelle had ever even laid eyes on Angela Diaz was on June 17th when Michelle was in court for that second restraining order request against her, which caught her completely by surprise. She had totally moved on with her life at that point and was dating other people and focusing on school, so when she was asked to come in and defend herself in court, she barely knew what to say. It didn't make any sense. And then when Michelle was arrested for the second time and couldn't make bail and so had to just sit in jail till her court date, her family hired a lawyer to investigate and figure out who was actually behind the harassment, because it wasn't Michelle. And what their lawyer would discover was truly shocking. Every horrible, threatening email that was sent to Angela's inbox was sent by Angela. The rape fantasy ads on Craigslist? Angela. The supposed attempted rape attack on Angela in her parking garage? That was completely made up. It never happened. She made those marks on her neck. She ripped her clothes off. It had all been an elaborate setup by Angela and by Ian. They had been in on this together. At the time they launched this frame job of Michelle, they were only a few weeks away from that 6-month deadline that Ian had to either sell the condo and split the profits with Michelle or take over the whole mortgage. And apparently, Ian and Angela believed their plan would result in Michelle losing her claim to the condo, and their legal agreement around the condo would become null and void, thereby saving Ian from being forced to sell the condo or having to potentially pay a higher price for it. The pair were so convinced this plan was going to work that Angela even lied about being pregnant. It was all a ruse to make it seem like Michelle's harassment had led Angela to lose her pregnancy. She was also lying about having cancer. Michelle's lawyer quickly uncovered lots of these holes in Ian and Angela's plan, and finally, after Michelle had sat in prison for 89 days after that second time she was arrested, she was released. On Tuesday, October 17th, 2017, Angela Diaz pleaded guilty to 10 felony and 22 misdemeanor charges, including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and falsely reporting a crime to a peace officer. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. Ian Diaz was not charged with any crimes at the time and continued in his job as a U.S. Marshal. But 2 years later, on December 20th, 2019, Michelle filed a civil rights lawsuit against Ian, alleging that he was in fact the mastermind of the plot that resulted in her wrongful imprisonment. She also brought charges against the Anaheim Police Department for their failure to properly follow up on evidence they discovered early in the investigation that showed the threatening emails Michelle was accused of sending, in fact, originated from the Diaz household. On Friday, May 3rd, 2021, the Anaheim police announced they had reached an undisclosed cash settlement with Michelle, and then a little over a week later, on May 13th, Ian Diaz was arrested and charged the following day with 1 count of conspiracy to commit cyberstalking, 1 count of cyberstalking, and 1 count of perjury for his false testimony in a deposition in connection with a federal civil lawsuit. If convicted, Ian faces a maximum penalty of 5 years in prison on each of the counts. His case is still pending. Since her public exoneration back in 2017, Michelle has gone on to finish her MBA, she has left California, and she found a great job in marketing with a beauty company. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please convince the 5-star review button to get a very large, intricate tattoo that they were on the fence about getting, and then once they follow through and get it, shrug your shoulders and tell them, meh, I don't like it very much. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do check the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.